In the shifting frontiers of the Adriatic world, where Roman order met tribal resistance, a sudden and dramatic clash unfolded, one that revealed both the strength and the vulnerability of Rome's military power. What began as a routine campaign against the Istrians quickly spiraled into chaos as fear, confusion, and misjudgment pushed a disciplined army to the brink of collapse. Yet within the same day, through determination and swift action, that same army would rise again, reclaiming its honor in a brutal and decisive counterattack. A portion of this historical account has been lost over time, leaving the opening abrupt and incomplete. Yet, from surviving summaries, the broader situation can still be understood. The events unfold in a period when Rome was preparing for larger conflicts, while also dealing with unrest in its northern Adriatic frontier. Among the tribes in this region were the Istrians, a people who had once lived quietly but had grown increasingly hostile. Their leader, Epulo, was said to have armed the younger generation, winning their loyalty by encouraging bold raids and promises of plunder. This shift transformed a once stable society into a restless and aggressive force, setting the stage for confrontation. The Roman commander did not hesitate. After consulting his officers, he chose swift action over delay. The army marched out from Aquileia and established a camp near the waters of Timavus, close to the sea. Naval support soon joined them, bringing ships, supplies, and a sense of security along the coastline. The harbour quickly became a centre of activity, with goods constantly moving inland toward the camp. Defensive positions were set, but they were stretched thin. Small detachments guarded the perimeter, while others protected supply routes and foraging parties. Nearby, a small Gallic force under a minor king watched events unfold, adding another uncertain element to the situation. Unseen by the Romans, the Istrians had already taken position behind a nearby hill. From there, they carefully observed every movement. They noticed weaknesses, unprotected traders, scattered guards, and a general lack of cohesion in certain areas. At dawn, under the cover of mist, they struck. The attack was sudden and coordinated, hitting two key positions at once. As the fog lifted, distorted shapes and shifting shadows made the enemy appear far larger than they truly were. Panic spread quickly. Soldiers fled toward the main camp, unable to explain what they had seen, their fear spreading faster than the enemy itself. Inside the camp, confusion turned into chaos. With no clear defense organized at the entrances, men rushed in every direction, colliding with one another in the dim light. Then a single cry rang out, an urgent call to flee toward the sea. It was enough. What began as a few scattered movements turned into a full retreat. Armed and unarmed alike abandoned their positions. Even the commander himself could not stop the tide. Orders were ignored, authority dissolved, and discipline vanished in the rush toward the shoreline. Only one officer stood firm. With a small group of men, he attempted to organize resistance as the enemy poured into the abandoned camp. They fought fiercely, holding their ground as long as possible. But they were overwhelmed. Their stand was brief but intense, ending in total loss. With no opposition left, the Istrians moved freely through the camp, seizing supplies and breaking into command quarters. What they found astonished them. Food prepared, goods neatly arranged, and signs of comfort they were not accustomed to. Their leader, without hesitation, began to feast. Soon, discipline among them collapsed as well. The warriors, forgetting the battle entirely, indulged in food and drink. Meanwhile, along the shore, the Roman forces were in disarray. Sailors hurried to secure what they could, while frightened soldiers scrambled onto boats or into the water. Tension between the naval crews and the fleeing infantry quickly escalated into violence. In the chaos, men turned on each other, and fighting broke out among allies. Only when the commander ordered the fleet to pull away did the situation begin to stabilize. Gradually, he gathered those who still had weapons. The number was shockingly small. Many cavalrymen had even abandoned their horses. The once organised army now resembled a scattered crowd rather than a fighting force. Yet the situation was not beyond recovery. Messages were sent to recall other units. At the same time, a new plan began to take shape. Officers rallied the remaining troops, urging them to reclaim what had been lost. Fresh forces approached, encouraged by the idea that the enemy, distracted by plunder, would be vulnerable. They moved quickly, combining speed with determination. The argument was simple, but powerful. The camp had been taken through surprise, and it could be taken back the same way. As they advanced, confidence grew. One officer pointed out the obvious. If the enemy had been fully prepared, they would have secured the defences and pursued the fleeing army. Their failure to do so suggested carelessness. This insight proved correct. When the counterattack began, the Roman soldiers met little organised resistance. Some of the enemy managed to escape, but most were caught off guard. Many were still overcome by exhaustion or drink, unable to react in time. The assault was swift and decisive. The camp was retaken with overwhelming force. The fighting turned into a slaughter, with little mercy shown. Those who had been left behind, even the wounded, joined in the attack once they realised the situation had changed. One cavalryman, despite his injuries, distinguished himself by striking down numerous opponents. The losses among the Istrians were severe, while the Roman casualties, though not insignificant, were far smaller by comparison. The enemy leader managed to escape, barely conscious, and carried away by his followers. Everything else was recovered: equipment, supplies, and control of the camp. The earlier panic was replaced by a determined effort to restore honour. What had nearly become a disaster was reversed in a single decisive moment. News of the initial defeat, however, had already begun to spread. Travellers who had narrowly avoided the captured camp carried alarming reports back to Aquileia and eventually to Rome. The story grew with each retelling. By the time it reached the capital, it was believed that the entire army had been destroyed. Panic followed. Emergency measures were declared, new troops were raised, and preparations for a larger conflict began immediately. But just as quickly, the truth emerged. Messages arrived confirming that the army had survived and regained control. Relief swept through the city. The emergency measures were cancelled and the newly raised troops were dismissed. What had seemed like a catastrophe turned out to be a narrow escape. With reinforcements approaching, the Istrians abandoned their positions and withdrew to their settlements. The Roman commanders regrouped and moved their forces into winter quarters, bringing an end to the immediate crisis. Order had been restored, but the events left a clear lesson. Discipline, once broken, could bring an army to the edge of destruction, and only swift leadership could pull it back. In the aftermath, political tensions surfaced back in Rome. Accusations were made, and attempts followed to strip authority from those involved in the campaign. Debate and conflict replaced unity, showing that the struggle did not end on the battlefield. At the same time, returning officials reported on their actions and sought recognition for their efforts, closing one chapter while another quietly began. The campaign against the Istrians, though brief, revealed both the fragility and resilience of Roman power. In a single day, an army had fallen into chaos, lost its camp, and then reclaimed it through determination and opportunity. It was a reminder that in war, victory and defeat can stand only moments apart. At the same time, Rome was being pulled into crises on several fronts. Disturbing news arrived from Sardinia, where the praetor Titus Ebutius reported that the Ilienses, joined by their Bellari allies, had risen against Roman authority. The province, already weakened by plague, was in no condition to resist. Disease had devastated the troops, leaving the army too reduced to defend the countryside. Sardinian envoys soon appeared before the Senate and confirmed the scale of the disaster. They begged for help, not only for their towns, but for the land itself, since many had already given up hope of protecting their farms. Because the current magistrates were about to leave office, the Senate postponed a final decision and passed the matter on to the incoming officials. Not long afterward, another delegation arrived, this time from Lycia, and their complaint was no less bitter. They spoke of the Rhodians, under whose control they had been placed after Rome's settlement of the eastern Mediterranean, and described their treatment in the darkest terms. In their eyes, life under a foreign king had been harsh, but still preferable to what they now endured. They said that Rhodian domination did not stop at political control. It reached into their homes, their bodies, and their dignity. According to their testimony, wives and children were humiliated, private citizens were beaten and degraded, and the Lycians were treated not as allies or protected communities, but as if they were human property. The Senate was deeply moved by the appeal. A formal letter was entrusted to the Lycians, making Rome's position clear to Rhodes. No free people were to be treated as slaves, and the Lycians were to be regarded as communities under protection, not as a conquered population to be abused at will. Amid these disputes came a display of Roman victory. 2 triumphs followed one another in quick succession, both celebrating campaigns in Spain. The first belonged to Sempronius Gracchus, who had fought successfully against the Celtiberians and their allies. The next day, Lucius Postumius celebrated his own triumph over the Lusitanians and other Spanish groups in the same broad theatre of war. Great quantities of silver were carried in procession, a public reminder that conquest brought wealth as well as glory. The spoils were then distributed among the troops. Common soldiers received a substantial reward, centurions were given double, cavalrymen triple, and allied troops shared in the same scale of payment. It was the kind of carefully staged generosity that strengthened loyalty while also displaying the state's power before the Roman people. During this same period, the consul Marcus Junius returned from Istria to preside over elections. But his arrival did not bring him peace. The tribunes Papirius and Licinius pursued him relentlessly in the Senate and then in front of the people. Their attack centered on the conduct of the war in Istria and, even more sharply, on the conduct of Aulus Manlius. Junius defended himself by saying that he had spent very little time in the province and knew no more than what he had heard from others. That answer satisfied no one. The tribunes pressed further, asking why Manlius himself had not come to explain how he had abandoned the province assigned to him and crossed into Istria without proper authority. They demanded to know when the Senate had declared such a war and when the Roman people had authorized it. Even if Manlius had claimed success, they argued, the facts would have condemned him. Roman detachments had been caught off guard. The camp had been overrun. Cavalry and infantry had been cut down, and the survivors had fled in panic. Worst of all, they said, the consul himself had led the rush to the ships. Since he had refused to account for his behaviour while still holding office, they insisted he would have to answer once he stood again as a private citizen. The elections then went forward. Gaius Claudius Pulcher and Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus were chosen as consuls, followed by the election of praetors. Their provinces were assigned in the usual way, but Sardinia stood apart from the others, because the unrest there had become so dangerous that it was treated as a major military command. Gracchus drew Sardinia, while Claudius received Istria. Gaul was divided into 2 commands. When the new consuls entered office in mid-March, Sardinia and Istria immediately rose to the top of the agenda. The Sardinian envoys who had been forced to wait for the new administration were finally admitted to the Senate, together with Lucius Minucius Thermus, who who had served under Manlius in Istria. Both sides described their provinces as unstable and dangerous. At the same time, another issue surfaced inside Italy itself, and it struck the Senate with unusual force. Representatives of the Latin allies had fought hard even to gain an audience, wearing down both censors and former consuls before they were finally heard. Their complaint was that large numbers of their citizens had enrolled themselves at Rome and taken up residence there. If that process continued, they warned, their home communities would be emptied, their towns would decline, their farms would be abandoned, and their ability to provide soldiers would collapse. The Samnites and the Paeligni added a similar grievance. Thousands of families, they said, had left and settled at Fregalae, yet the military burden had not been redistributed fairly. The old community still supplied the same number of troops, while the receiving town did not make up the difference. The deeper problem, they explained, was fraud. Men were exploiting the legal path by which members of Latin communities could gain Roman citizenship. The law had been designed with conditions meant to preserve the population of allied towns, but those conditions were being manipulated. Some men transferred their sons into the household of Roman citizens as slaves, with the understanding that the boys would later be freed and become Roman citizens. Others, lacking children of their own, used adoption as a legal fiction to qualify. Over time, even these pretenses were abandoned. People simply moved to Rome, entered the census, and treated the change as accomplished fact. The Allies asked the Senate to stop this drain on their population, to send people back to their home communities, and to create legal barriers against using children, adoption, or false arrangements to alter civic status. The Senate agreed. With hostilities still active in Sardinia and Istria, both provinces were given to the consuls for military action. The Senate ordered a massive levy. For Sardinia, 2 legions were to be raised, each with more than 5,000 infantry and 300 cavalry, along with a large allied force and a small naval reserve of quinqueremes in case transport or coastal operations became necessary. Exactly the same military strength was assigned to Istria. Reinforcements were also sent to Spain. Rome was clearly preparing for a year of intense campaigning on several fronts at once. Before the consuls could draw lots officially, reports of ominous signs began to circulate. In the countryside, a stone was said to have fallen from the sky into a sacred grove. A malformed child had been born. A 4-footed snake had been seen. Lightning struck buildings in Capua and burned ships at Puteoli. Even as these reports were being announced, a wolf ran through Rome itself in broad daylight, entering by one gate and escaping by another while the city erupted in noise behind it. The response followed the old Roman pattern. Sacrifices were ordered, sacred rites were performed, and a public day of supplication was held at the shrines of the gods. Only after these ceremonies had been completed were the provinces formally assigned. Istria went to Claudius. Sardinia went to Sempronius. Soon after, Gaius Claudius introduced legislation dealing with the allies and the citizenship crisis. An edict ordered that all Latins who had registered at Rome, or whose ancestors had done so during an earlier census and afterward, were to return to their own communities before the 1st of November. The praetor Lucius Mummius was charged with investigating those who ignored the order. The Senate added further precautions. If any magistrate were asked to free a slave or confirm someone's free status, the petitioner had to swear that the actor was not being used as a device to alter civic standing. Without that oath, the manumission was to be refused. Rome was closing legal loopholes and trying to restore a boundary it feared was dissolving. While these measures were being taken in the city, the former consuls Marcus Junius and Aulus Manlius had remained through the winter at Aquileia. When spring arrived, they led their forces into Istrian territory and ravaged the countryside. The Istrians watched their land being destroyed and knew they lacked the strength to face two Roman armies in a prolonged struggle. Yet anger overcame caution. Young men gathered from many communities and launched a fierce counterattack. Their first blow was energetic, but it could not be sustained. Around 4,000 were killed, and the rest scattered back to their towns. Realizing they could not continue, they first sent envoys to ask for peace, and then submitted hostages when Rome demanded them. News of this reached Rome in a dispatch from the proconsuls, and it caused an immediate reaction in Gaius Claudius. He feared that if the war in Istria ended too quickly, he might lose both the province and the opportunity for military glory. In a fit of impatience, he set out at night almost in secret, without carrying out the traditional rituals expected before a consul left for war. He did not properly announce vows, he did not depart with the visible signs of military office prepared in the customary way, and he told almost no one except his colleague. He simply rushed for his province. Once there, his behaviour only made matters worse. He called an assembly of the troops and began publicly shaming Aulus Manlius for the earlier debacle in which the Roman camp had been lost. The soldiers reacted badly, since many of them had themselves fled in that panic. Claudius then turned on Marcus Junius, accusing him of sharing responsibility for disgraceful conduct. Finally, he ordered both men to leave the province. They refused. Their answer was sharp. They would obey when Claudius himself had first obeyed ancestral custom and departed Rome properly, with vows spoken on the Capitol and the signs of command duly observed. Enraged, Claudius summoned the man serving as Manlius's quaestor and demanded chains, threatening to send both former consuls back to Rome in shackles. That order too was ignored. The quaestor took courage from the mood of the soldiers, who sided openly with the older commanders and showed growing hostility toward the consul. Humiliated by mockery and resistance, Claudius withdrew to Aquileia in the very ship that had brought him. From there, he sent instructions to his colleague in Rome, telling him to gather the recruits intended for Istria at Aquileia, so that nothing would delay his second departure once he had performed the proper rites. His colleague complied and fixed a date for the troops to assemble. Claudius followed his own letter back to Rome, immediately denounced Manlius and Junius before the people, stayed only a few days, then finally left again in the correct form, with vows pronounced and the outward symbols of military command in place. By the time Claudius returned, the previous commanders had already begun a full assault on Nesactium, the chief stronghold to which the Istrian leaders and their king, Epulo, had withdrawn. Claudius arrived with 2 fresh legions, sent the old army and its generals home, and took over the siege. Siege engines were prepared and the attack tightened. A river running near the town protected the defenders and supplied them with water. After considerable effort, Claudius had its course diverted into a new channel. The sudden loss of water terrified the defenders, who saw it as something uncanny and overwhelming. Yet even then, they did not seek terms. Near the end of the fighting in Istria, trouble began to stir elsewhere. The Ligurs started holding councils of war, and dispatches from the north warned the Senate that the situation was becoming dangerous. A former praetor, Tiberius Claudius, held Pisa with a single legion and reported what he was seeing. The Senate forwarded the matter to Gaius Claudius, who had by then moved on from Istria, and authorized him to act against the Ligurs if he judged the time right. At the same time, Rome decreed public thanksgiving in response to Claudius' success in Istria. The other consul, Tiberius Sempronius, was also campaigning effectively in Sardinia. He led his army into the land of the Ilienses, where the Balari had joined them in strength. A pitched battle followed. The Sardinian forces were defeated, driven from the field, and stripped of their camp. thousands were killed. On the next day, Sempronius gathered the captured weapons into a great heap and burned them as an offering to Vulcan before leading his army back into winter quarters among allied communities. It was a victory meant not only to destroy resistance, but also to present the campaign as a properly sanctioned Roman war under divine favour. Gaius Claudius, acting on the reports from the north and the Senate's authorization, transferred his forces from Istria into Liguria. The enemy had advanced as far as the Scultena River and pitched camp in open country. There, the battle was fought. The slaughter was severe. 15,000 Ligurs were said to have fallen. Hundreds were captured, along with dozens of military standards, and their camp too was taken. The survivors fled into the hills and organised resistance collapsed. Claudius then ravaged the surrounding plains without serious opposition. In a single year, he had campaigned successfully against 2 different peoples and had restored order in 2 separate provinces, an achievement rare enough to give him a powerful claim to distinction when he returned to Rome. That same year, Rome continued to be haunted by prodigies. A strange bird in the territory of Cristumium was said to have cracked a sacred stone with its beak. In Campania, a cow reportedly spoke. At Syracuse, a wild bull broke away from the herd, mounted a bronze statue of a cow, and spattered it with seed. Each sign was answered with ritual, a local day of supplication, public maintenance for the miraculous cow, ceremonies directed by diviners in Sicily. Alongside these religious anxieties came ordinary affairs of state. A senior priest died and was replaced by his son. A new Roman colony of 2,000 citizens was founded at Luna on land, once held by the Liguris, and before them by the Etruscans. Each colonist received an allotment of land, and another piece of Rome's frontier was secured by settlement. When Gaius Claudius returned to the city and reported his campaigns in Istria and Liguria, the Senate granted him a triumph. He celebrated it while still in office, marking victory over both peoples at once. Money was carried in the procession in large amounts, and once again rewards were distributed to the troops. Yet this triumph exposed one of the tensions inside Rome's military world. Roman citizens received the full share. Centurions and cavalrymen received more according to rank. The Allied soldiers, however, were given only half as much as Roman citizens. As they walked behind the consul's chariot, they did so in bitter silence. Their resentment was obvious. The spectacle of triumph displayed not only the glory of conquest, but also the inequalities built into Rome's system of alliance. That resentment mattered because the war in the north was not truly over. While Claudius was celebrating victory, the Ligurs realized that Roman forces had been withdrawn, and that the garrison at Pisa had also been reduced. Their fear faded. Quietly they raised another army, crossed the mountains by side paths, descended into the plains, and after ravaging the countryside around Mutina, struck the colony itself by surprise and seized it. The news caused immediate alarm in Rome. The Senate ordered Claudius to hold the elections without delay and then return at once to recover the colony. New consuls and praetors were chosen. Claudius's command was extended for another year in Gaul, and to prevent the Istrians from attempting a similar uprising, the allied contingents he had brought back for his triumph were to be sent once more to hold the region. When the new consuls entered office, religion again cast a shadow over public affairs. During the customary sacrifice to Jupiter, one victim was found to have a defective liver, lacking the expected form. The report was delivered to the Senate, and new sacrifices were ordered until a favourable sign could be obtained. Yet the omens grew darker. The other consul also encountered repeated failures in sacrifice, and one troubling sign followed another. The Senate insisted that full-grown victims continue to be offered until the gods gave approval. Even when more acceptable results were eventually obtained, one goddess still refused to yield a reassuring sign. The provinces were then assigned. One consul received Pisa, the other, Liguria. New troops were to be raised in large numbers, both Roman and allied. Commands in Spain were prolonged, since two praetors argued for exemptions from provincial service, one citing the need for continuity in Sardinia, and the other invoking religious obligations that prevented departure. Oaths were taken, exemptions granted, and the existing commanders in Spain were left in place with reinforcements. It was an example of Roman pragmatism in action. Even in a system built on annual office, continuity could be preserved when the Senate believed it necessary. The Latin festival, one of Rome's most important public rites, soon had to be repeated because an error had been made in the prayers during the sacrifice. The priests ruled that the ceremony had not been validly completed and that the people responsible must supply fresh victims for it to be done again. This decision only deepened a mood of unease that had already taken hold across the city. That unease seemed justified when the consul Gnaeus Cornelius collapsed while returning from the Alban Mount. He suffered a seizure, was taken away for treatment, and soon died. His body was brought back to Rome and buried with full honour. His death, coming so soon after the troubled omens and repeated sacrificial failures, intensified the sense that the year was unfolding under divine warning. The surviving consul, Quintus Petilius, was instructed to hold elections for a replacement as soon as the auspices allowed, and to proclaim a new date for the Latin festival. Before that could settle public nerves, more signs were reported. A comet was seen above Tusculum. Lightning struck the temple of Apollo and private homes at Gabii. At Gravisce, it hit the walls and gate. The Senate responded in the traditional way, referring the matter to the priests and ordering that the prodigies be expiated according to sacred law. Throughout all these events, Rome appears as a state fighting wars abroad, while also trying to maintain order at home through ritual, law, and relentless political management. Armies moved across Sardinia, Istria, Liguria, and Spain. Delegations pleaded for justice. Allies protested exploitation. Magistrates quarrelled over authority and prestige, and over everything hung the old Roman conviction that military success and civic stability depended not only on force and discipline, but on preserving the fragile balance between the human world and the will of the gods. At first, the consuls were unable to focus fully on war. Religious duties demanded attention, and before those obligations were finished, one of the consuls died. His colleague then found himself tied down by the need to oversee the election of a replacement and to repeat the Latin festival, which had been judged defective and had to be performed again. While Rome was occupied by ritual, procedure, and loss, Gaius Claudius moved decisively in the north. He led his army against Mutina, the colony that the Ligurs had captured the year before. The campaign was swift. Within only 3 days of opening the siege, he stormed the town, drove out its occupiers and restored it to the colonists. The slaughter inside the walls was severe, and thousands of Ligurs were killed. Claudius immediately sent word back to Rome, describing not only the recovery of the city, but presenting the success as proof of his own courage and fortune. In his account, no enemy of Rome remained anywhere south of the Alps, and the conquered land, he declared, was so extensive that it could be divided among countless future settlers. At about the same time, Tiberius Sempronius was continuing his campaign in Sardinia with equal energy. A succession of victories finally broke the resistance of the island peoples. 15,000 Sardinians were said to have fallen, and every community that had turned away from Roman rule was brought back under control. Those who had previously paid tribute were now forced to pay double. Others were ordered to supply grain. Once the province had been brought to heel, Sempronius gathered hostages from across the island. a clear sign that Roman authority had been restored in both military and political terms. Envoys were then sent to Rome to announce the outcome. They asked the Senate to give formal thanks to the gods for victories won under the command and auspices of Tiberius Sempronius, and they requested permission for him to leave the province and return home with his army. Their report was delivered before the senators in the Temple of Apollo. The Senate responded with public thanksgiving and ordered a large round of sacrifice, but it did not grant Sempronius release from his province. However successful the campaign had been, the island was considered too important and too recently subdued to be left without the man who had just pacified it. Sempronius and his army were instructed to remain there for the rest of the year. Meanwhile, the political machinery at Rome moved on. The election that had been arranged to choose a single new consul was completed on the appointed day. Quintus Petilius presided over the process, and Gaius Valerius Laevinus was chosen as his new colleague. He entered office immediately. For Laevinus, the appointment brought exactly the opportunity he had long wanted. He had desired an active command, and almost at once news arrived that seemed to promise one. The Ligurs had risen again. On the 5th day of August, he assumed military dress and departed for his province. Once the Senate heard the reports, it ordered the 3rd Legion to march to Gaul and reinforce the proconsul Gaius Claudius. In addition, naval officers were sent with ships to Pisa, where they were to patrol the Ligurian coastline and apply pressure from the sea. Quintus Petilius also named a day for the army to gather at Pisa. Claudius, upon hearing that the Ligures had rebelled once more, carried out an emergency levy to strengthen the troops already with him near Parma, and then marched toward the frontier of Ligurian territory. The approach of Claudius was enough to revive memories the Ligures would rather have forgotten. Not long before, he had defeated them badly at the Scultena River, and the fear of meeting him again in open battle was real. This time, they chose terrain over courage. Instead of descending to fight on level ground, they occupied 2 mountains, Letum and Ballista, and reinforced their position with walls. A group of about 1,500 Ligures, delayed in withdrawing from the plains, was trapped and killed before it could reach safety. The rest held to the heights. Even in retreat, their violence did not soften. The captives they had taken from Mutina were savagely mutilated and murdered. Animals were slaughtered near shrines in a frenzy of destruction, rather than sacrificed in any orderly or reverent way. Once they had exhausted their rage on living things, they turned to the plunder itself, smashing useful goods and containers against stone walls. It was destruction for its own sake, the brutality of a people cornered and furious. Quintus Petilius, the consul, had no intention of allowing a campaign of such importance to be concluded without him. He sent a message ordering Gaius Claudius to leave Liguria and join him in Gaul, where he would wait at Campi Macri. Claudius obeyed. He broke camp, withdrew from Liguria, and handed over his forces to the consul at the appointed place. A few days later, the other consul, Gaius Valerius, arrived as well. There, the armies were reorganized. The commanders divided the forces between them and together carried out a purification ceremony over the united troops before moving out again. It was then decided that the enemy would be attacked from different directions. Lots were cast to determine the area in which each commander would operate. The ritual surrounding this decision later became a matter of some concern. Valerius was widely considered to have performed his part correctly because he remained within the sacred boundary required for such proceedings. Petilius, however, was later said by the augurs to have made a fault in the ritual. Although the lot had been placed properly within the sacred enclosure, he himself remained outside it, when he too should have entered. In a world where military success and religious correctness were deeply intertwined, such an error would not be forgotten. After the armies separated, Petilius advanced to face the ridge that connected Mount Ballista and Mount Letum in a single chain. There, he set up camp opposite the enemy position. Tradition later remembered a striking detail from that day. Addressing his soldiers before the battle, Petilius spoke with complete confidence and declared that Letum would be his before nightfall. The word carried an ominous double meaning, but he either did not notice it or refused to care. He launched the attack up the mountains with 2 divisions at once. The column with which he advanced in person made progress quickly. The other division, however, met heavier resistance and began to give way. Petilius rode across to steady the line and restore order. He succeeded in rallying his men, but in doing so he exposed himself recklessly. Riding too far forward in front of the standards, he was struck by a javelin and killed. The enemy did not realize that the Roman commander had fallen. Only a handful of his own men saw what had happened, and they understood immediately how dangerous the news would be if it spread. So they concealed the body and kept silent. Victory, they knew, depended on maintaining the army's momentum. The deception worked. Infantry and cavalry pressed the attack without hesitation, overwhelmed the defenders, and took the mountains even though the man leading the campaign was already dead. Around 5,000 Ligurs were killed. Roman losses, by comparison, were said to be remarkably small. Yet the battle did not end the unease surrounding the consul's death. Alongside the obvious fulfillment of his ill-omened words, there were later claims that the sacred signs before battle had not been entirely sound. The keeper of the chickens, responsible for reporting the auspices, was said to have noticed a problem and to have informed the consul, who nevertheless proceeded. Whether the warning was ignored out of haste, confidence, or fatal stubbornness, the result was the same. Petilius won the field but lost his life in the very act of taking it. The surviving text from this part of the story breaks off, but the political consequences were remembered. Legal and religious experts later maintained that when both regular consuls died in the same year, one by illness and the other in battle, a substitute consul did not have the right to hold the elections in the normal way. That opinion reflects how seriously the Romans took the intersection of law, religion, and public office. Even after victories, uncertainty could linger if ritual order had been disturbed or if the chain of magistracies had been broken in an irregular way. What followed in the north was a further effort to secure the region. Marcus Aemilius campaigned against Ligurian and Gallic groups, living on both sides of the Apennines. Publius Mucius moved against those who had ravaged Luna and Pisa. Once he had fully subdued them, he took away their weapons, stripping them of the means to renew the revolt. These campaigns were completed with speed and effectiveness, and the Senate at Rome responded by ordering a public thanksgiving and sacrifices, in honour of the victories won in Gaul and Liguria under the command and auspices of the consuls. The uprising that had seemed dangerous early in the year was suppressed more quickly and more easily than many had feared. Yet even as those western troubles were being contained, attention was beginning to shift eastward. Anxiety about Macedonia was growing beneath the surface. Perseus was suspected of stirring up conflict between the Dardani and the Bastinae. Roman envoys who had been sent to investigate conditions in Macedonia returned to Rome and reported that war had indeed broken out in Dardania. At almost the same moment, spokesmen came from King Perseus to deny that he had encouraged the Bastinae or had any hand in their actions. The Senate chose not to declare him innocent, but neither did it openly condemn him. Instead, it sent a warning. Perseus was to make certain, by his conduct, that he could be seen honouring his treaty with Rome. It was a cautious answer, but also a pointed one. The problem in the north was becoming more serious by the day. The Dardani had hoped that the Bastinae might merely pass through their lands or withdraw. but it became increasingly clear that they were not leaving and were instead growing more oppressive. Worse still, they were receiving support from neighbouring peoples, among them the Thracians and the Scordici. Faced with that danger, the Dardani decided on action. It was winter, and they deliberately chose that season in the hope that some of the Bastarnae's allies would return home, leaving the main force exposed. Once they believed that had happened and that the Bastarnae stood alone, they assembled near the enemy camp and divided their army in two. One force would take the direct road and attack openly. The other would circle around by a remote pass and strike from the rear. The plan failed before it could fully unfold. Before the flanking force had managed to get behind the camp, the battle had already been decided. The main Dardanian attack was defeated and driven back into a nearby town about 12 miles away. The Bastarnae followed immediately, surrounded the place, and expected either to storm it the next day or to frighten the defenders into surrender. The second Dardanian force, the one that had been sent by the longer route, still knew nothing of the disaster. Approaching from the rear, it found not a prepared enemy but the abandoned and undefended camp of the Bastarnae. The fuller story is lost, but the episode reveals the scale of disorder in the region. What had begun as a local struggle was turning into something broader and more dangerous, something that Rome could not ignore for long. It was in this same wider atmosphere of uncertainty that Antiochus, king of the Seleucid realm, emerged in a portrait unlike that of most rulers. He was a man whose behaviour seemed impossible to pin down. At times, he adopted Roman habits in public, even sitting on an ivory chair to hear minor cases and judge disputes of trivial importance. Yet his manner was so unstable, so strangely mixed, between dignity and absurdity. No one was ever entirely certain what sort of king stood before them. He did not behave toward friends as a king usually did. He smiled readily at men he scarcely knew, and often neglected those who stood close to him. His generosity was equally inconsistent. Some men of rank and self-importance received from him gifts so childish that they felt mocked by them, food, toys, or little trifles unworthy of their station. Others, who had expected nothing at all, were suddenly enriched. To some observers he seemed merely eccentric, to others foolish, and to others still plainly unbalanced. Yet in certain matters there was nothing small or ridiculous about him. In generosity towards cities and in devotion to sacred building, he showed a genuinely royal scale of ambition. He promised to surround Megalopolis with walls and supplied most of the money needed for the project. At Tegea, he began work on a magnificent marble theatre. At Cyzicus, he furnished one of the city's important public dining buildings with a golden dinner service. To the Rhodians, he sent gifts of every sort, not one spectacular object alone, but a wide range of useful offerings suited to many needs. His religious generosity was no less striking. At Athens, he took up the great, unfinished temple of Olympian Zeus, a structure vast enough to match the majesty of the god. On Delos, he adorned sanctuaries with lavish altars and abundant statuary. At Antioch, he planned an immense temple to Capitoline Jupiter, with walls covered in gold and a ceiling sheathed in gleaming panels. Many of these works remained unfinished because his time was too short. But his intentions were enormous, and he scattered similar promises across many parts of the Greek world. He also surpassed many earlier rulers in the splendour of the spectacles he sponsored. Most of these were traditional entertainments with generous numbers of Greek performers. But he also introduced something less familiar and at first more disturbing: gladiatorial combat in the Roman style. When these games first appeared before his people, they inspired more horror than delight, because the audience was unused to such bloodshed as public spectacle. But by repeating the performances more frequently, sometimes with controlled wounds and sometimes with no mercy at all, he gradually accustomed them to the sight. In time, what had once repelled them began to fascinate them. Many young men developed an enthusiasm for fighting, and what had initially required the costly importation of trained combatants from Rome began to take root locally. The culture of spectacle changed under his influence, and the boundary between foreign entertainment and accepted custom began to fade. Elsewhere, Rome was preparing for another demanding year of administration and war. Provincial assignments were made, armies were organised, and additional forces were ordered into the field. Sardinia, Corsica, Spain, and Sicily all demanded attention. Reinforcements were voted for the commanders in Spain, while other provinces were left to operate with what they already had. The consuls were instructed to raise 2 new legions in the usual strength and to call up allied infantry and cavalry as well. But carrying out these levies proved extremely difficult because the plague that had ravaged livestock the previous year had now spread fully among human beings. Those who caught the illness rarely survived beyond the 7th day. Those who did survive often fell into lingering sickness afterward, most commonly a recurring fever that drained them over time rather than killing them at once. The toll was heavy everywhere, but slaves died in especially great numbers. Their bodies lay unburied along the roads because there were not enough hands to bury even the freeborn. Corpses rotted where they had fallen. Dogs and vultures, which might normally have been expected to gather in such conditions, were strangely absent, and people later remarked on that absence as something almost as unsettling as the pestilence itself. For 2 years, they said, not a vulture was seen, despite the heaps of dead men and animals. Such details reveal not only the scale of mortality, but the way catastrophe was perceived through signs, rumours, and fearful memory. The plague also cut deeply into the state's religious personnel. Important priests died, one after another, men holding some of the most respected sacred offices in Rome. Replacements had to be chosen for every vacancy, ensuring that the machinery of public religion would not come to a halt even as disease spread through the city and countryside. Yet the crisis showed no sign of ending. With no relief in sight, the Senate ordered the keepers of the sacred books to consult the ancient oracles. In response, a public day of prayer was decreed, and under the guidance of a leading magistrate, the Roman people made a solemn vow in the Forum. If disease and plague should depart from Roman territory, they would celebrate 2 days of festival and supplication. As so often in Roman memory, pestilence was accompanied by a flood of prodigies. In one district, a 2-headed boy was born. In another, an infant came into the world with only 1 hand. Elsewhere, a baby girl was born, already showing teeth. On a clear day, with no storm in the sky, a rainbow was seen over the temple of Saturn in the Forum. At the same time, 3 suns reportedly appeared together in the heavens. That very night, multiple shooting stars crossed the sky. In Lanuvium and Caere, people said that a crested serpent marked with golden spots had appeared in their towns. In Campania, an ox was said to have spoken. Whether feared as omens, repeated as rumour, or recorded as wonders, these stories reveal the atmosphere of strain under which the Roman state was living. On the 7th of June, envoys returned from Africa. They had first met Massinissa and then gone on to Carthage, and from the king more than from the Carthaginians themselves, they learned what had been taking place. They confirmed that ambassadors from Perseus had been received at Carthage and had held a secret meeting there by night in the temple of Aesculapius. Massinissa further claimed that Carthage had sent envoys of its own to Macedonia. The Carthaginians denied this, but not with the firmness that might have dispelled suspicion. The Senate reacted by sending envoys to Macedonia as well. Rome was clearly no longer content merely to observe events from afar. Around the same time, Perseus himself moved with an army and compelled the Dolopes into obedience. Some among them had resisted him and attempted to refer their disputes to Roman judgment instead. From there, he crossed the mountains and went to Delphi, saying that he wished to consult the oracle on religious matters that troubled him. His sudden appearance in the centre of Greece caused alarm far beyond the immediate region. Nearby communities were shaken, and urgent messages were sent eastward to inform King Eumenes. Perseus remained at Delphi only a short time and then returned to Macedonia without harming the lands through which he passed. In Phthiatic, Achaea and Thessaly, he made a point of passing peacefully. It was a calculated display. He did not rely only on restraint in movement. He also sent ambassadors and letters to communities across Greece, urging them to forget the quarrels they had had with his father. Those old disputes, he argued, should end with the dead king. With him, a new beginning was possible. There was no reason, he suggested, why relations could not be rebuilt in a spirit of trust and friendship. More than any other Greek group, the Achaeans drew his attention. Only they, along with the Athenians, had reached such hostility toward Macedonia that they had barred Macedonians from their territory altogether. That policy had consequences. Because the border was closed, Macedonia had become a refuge for runaway slaves from Achaea, since Achaeans themselves could not safely cross into the Macedonian kingdom. To recover them, Perseus noticed the opportunity. He had some of these slaves arrested and then sent a letter advising that it was the Achaeans' responsibility to find a way to prevent such escapes in the future. On the surface, it appeared restrained and even helpful. When the letter was read publicly by the Achaean magistrate Xenarchus, many found it reasonable. Some were especially inclined to welcome it because they hoped to recover valuable runaways. But not everyone was persuaded. Callicrates, who believed that the safety of the Achaean people rested on strict loyalty to their treaty with Rome, rose to speak against the king's message. He argued that what looked small was in fact dangerous. The issue was not a handful of slaves. The issue was whether the Achaeans were allowing Perseus to gain a foothold among them. Macedonia had been excluded for a reason. No royal envoys, no messengers, no opening through which influence could spread. Yet now, even without being present, Perseus was effectively pleading his case inside their assembly, and some were already nodding in approval. That, Callicrates warned, was exactly how greater dangers began. He pressed the point further. Wild animals, he said in essence, usually recoil from bait set in a trap. Men, by contrast, could be lured by the smallest advantage. In exchange for the hope of recovering a few miserable slaves, they were ready to weaken their own freedom. Perseus was not acting out of kindness. He was looking for an alliance, and any road toward him, however small at first, might lead away from Rome. War between Rome and Macedonia, Callicrates argued, was not some remote possibility. It had long been expected. It had merely been delayed by the death of Philip. Now it was coming. He then turned to the recent history of the Macedonian court. Philip, he reminded his audience, had two sons, Demetrius and Perseus. Demetrius had been superior in ancestry, character, and popularity, yet Philip had put him to death because his friendliness toward Rome made him suspect. Perseus had inherited because Philip intended the kingdom to remain in hostile hands. Everything Perseus had done since taking power, Callicrates claimed, pointed toward preparation for war. He had sent the Bastarnae against the Dardani. He had forced the Dolopes into submission. He had marched through central Greece and appeared suddenly at Delphi. Even his restraint, his refusal to harm those through whose lands he passed, was suspicious because it looked like deliberate charm. His letter to the Achaeans was no innocent courtesy. It was an attempt to overturn the policy that kept Macedonia out of the Peloponnese. First royal envoys would return, then exchanges of hospitality, then influence, and before long, perhaps armies. Callicrates concluded that nothing should be changed. Let the decree remain in force. If peace between Rome and Macedonia endured, relations could be reconsidered later. But for now, any new decision would be premature and dangerous. After him spoke Archo, the brother of the magistrate Xenarchus, and he answered in a very different spirit. Callicrates, he said, had made disagreement difficult by framing the entire matter as if anyone who opposed him must also be opposing Rome. By presenting himself as the defender of the Roman alliance, he made all others appear suspect before they had even spoken. Archo challenged his certainty. Callicrates talked, he said, as though he had just come from the private councils of Rome or from the king's own inner chamber. He claimed to know what had happened in secret, what Philip had intended, why Perseus inherited, what the Macedonians were planning, and what the Romans were thinking. But such confidence rested on guesswork dressed up as certainty. No one truly knew all these things. The facts surrounding Demetrius's death, Philip's intentions, and Perseus's future plans were not laid open before the Achaean assembly. Decisions, Archo argued, should be made not on suspicion and dramatic interpretation, but on what could actually be seen and known in public. Archo continued by arguing that the situation did not point toward war at all, but toward a guarded peace. Perseus, he reminded the assembly, had been recognized as king by Rome itself when he inherited the Macedonian throne. Roman envoys had gone to him, and he had received them warmly. These were not the signs of a ruler already at open odds with the Republic. If Rome itself could maintain formal relations with Perseus, then it was hard to see why the Achaeans alone should cling to an endless hostility. There was no compelling reason for them, and them alone, to preserve a state of permanent enmity with Macedonia. They were not helpless, and they were not exposed in the same way as some of the smaller peoples nearer the Macedonian frontier. Their own strength, together with their distance, gave them a measure of safety. And even if danger were closer than it seemed, he asked whether the Romans would value the loyalty of their long-standing allies less than that of peoples who had only recently stood against them. If other Greeks could maintain ordinary relations with Macedonia, why should the Achaeans be the single exception, cut off from all ordinary human dealings as if some universal bond had collapsed only in their case? He pressed the point by separating Perseus from the memory of Philip. If Philip's conduct had once driven the Achaeans to harsh measures, that did not automatically condemn his son. Perseus was a new king, not yet marked by wrongdoing, and he had shown a willingness to reverse the bitterness of the previous generation through gestures of restraint and generosity. Archo even suggested that the older balance sheet of Macedonian history should not be forgotten. Earlier Macedonian kings, he said, had done much for the Achaeans, enough that their services outweighed the wrongs associated with Philip, especially now that Philip himself was gone. He recalled the days when the Roman fleet had stood at Century and the Roman consul had waited nearby with his army, and yet the Achaeans had spent days debating whether to align with Rome or with Philip. That hesitation had not come from fear alone. It came from the long-standing relationship between the Achaeans and Macedonia, and from the memory of benefits once received from Macedonian rulers. Those older ties, he argued, should still matter. Not because the Achaeans should rush into a new alliance, but because they should not insist on being exceptional enemies forever. Archo then tried to strip away the alarm that his opponents had built around the issue. No one, he said, was proposing a fresh treaty or some binding political alliance with Perseus. No one was asking the Achaeans to commit themselves recklessly. The matter was much narrower. It concerned legal reciprocity and ordinary access. It was about whether Achaeans should be able to enter Macedonian territory, and whether Macedonians should be barred absolutely from Achaean land. If that barrier were relaxed in a practical way, runaway slaves would lose their safe refuge. That, in his view, was the real substance of the question. Why turn a limited public matter into a cause for panic, why inflate a manageable issue into proof of treason or betrayal? Why should some men make others appear suspicious merely to gain favour with Rome by seeming especially severe? If war came, he said, Perseus would have no reason to doubt that the Achaeans would stand with Rome. But as long as peace still lasted, there was no need to preserve every old resentment, as though reconciliation itself were dangerous. The speech appealed to many of the same men who had already responded favourably to the king's earlier letter. Yet no decision was made at once. The leading men of the Achaean assembly were offended by the manner of the approach. They thought it beneath their dignity that Perseus should try to achieve through a brief written message what he had not first thought worthy of a formal embassy. Later, the king corrected this and sent ambassadors in person, while the Achaeans were meeting at Megalopolis. Even then, however, those who feared giving offence to Rome moved carefully. They made sure the ambassadors were not allowed into the assembly itself. The discussion was not closed, but neither was it allowed to develop into open contact. Elsewhere in Greece, another kind of violence was consuming the Aetolians. Their political hatreds had turned inward so completely that they seemed to be destroying themselves by mutual slaughter. It looked less like civil conflict than like a people wearing itself away in repeated revenge. Eventually both sides, worn down by bloodshed, sent envoys to Rome and began to discuss terms for restoring some kind of internal peace. For a moment, exhaustion seemed stronger than hatred. But that moment did not last. A new outrage shattered the fragile movement toward reconciliation and reignited everything. A leading man named Eupolemus had personally guaranteed safe return for 80 prominent exiles who belonged to the faction of Proxenus and had been driven out from Hypata. Trusting his word, they came back. Eupolemus himself went out with a crowd to meet them, and the first moments of their return were full of embraces, greetings, and apparent goodwill. But once they had passed through the gates, they were butchered. Their appeals to the promise that had been given them meant nothing. Neither the pledge of honour nor the gods called upon to witness it could save them. The killings tore open the old wounds at once, and war burst out again with greater fury than before. Rome responded by sending commissioners to investigate and intervene. They went to Delphi, where representatives of both Aetolian factions argued their cases with all the intensity that years of hatred had created. In the debate, Proxenus was widely judged to have had the stronger cause and the stronger voice. Yet even this brought no resolution. Only a few days later, Proxenus was poisoned by his own wife, Orthobola. She was tried, condemned, and sent into exile. It was another grim example of a political world in which murder had become an extension of faction, rather than an interruption of it. Crete too was trapped in the same cycle of reckless violence. The islands, cities, and factions were gripped by a furious instability that seemed to feed on itself. The arrival of a Roman envoy with ships created, for a brief time, the hope that peace might be imposed or negotiated. A truce was arranged, but it lasted only 6 months. Once it expired, the war resumed more violently than before. At the same time, the Lycians continued to suffer under Rhodian pressure. Across the eastern Mediterranean, local conflicts overlapped, shifted, and flared again with very little warning. Yet for Rome, and for any account centred on Roman affairs, there was only so much space to follow every quarrel among foreign peoples in full detail. Even while those disturbances continued, Roman attention was fixed above all on matters where its own power, armies, and prestige were most directly involved. In Spain, a familiar problem returned. The Celtiberians, who had earlier submitted after defeat by Tiberius Gracchus, had remained quiet while the province was governed by Marcus Titinius. But with the arrival of Appius Claudius, that calm ended. The rebellion opened with a sudden strike against the Roman camp. It was just after dawn, The guards were already at their stations, posted along the walls and in the towers over the gates, and they saw the enemy approaching from a distance. The alarm was raised at once. Appius Claudius had the signal for battle given, addressed the soldiers in a short and urgent speech, and ordered a sortie through all 3 gates at once. At first the fighting was close and confused. The Celtiberians pressed hard against the exits and tried to bottle the Romans inside the camp. In the narrow gate passages, the Roman troops could not deploy properly, and only a limited number could fight at any given moment. The struggle was cramped, crowded, and balanced, but once more soldiers forced their way out beyond the walls, the situation changed. The Romans were finally able to spread their line, extend toward the wings, and match the enemy's broader encirclement. Then they surged forward with a sudden violence that the Celtiberians could not withstand. The resistance collapsed quickly. Before the morning was far advanced, the enemy had already been broken. Thousands were killed or captured. Many standards were seized, and the hostile camp itself fell into Roman hands. The survivors scattered back to their towns, and with that, the uprising was effectively over in a single day. After such a defeat, the Celtiberians submitted quietly once again to Roman control. Back in Rome, the censors chosen for the year carried out one of their most serious public duties, the review of the Senate. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, already the chief priest, was recognized as the leading member of the Senate, and 9 men were expelled from the role. Among those removed were figures of high visibility, including former magistrates and men from distinguished houses. One of them had held command in Spain not long before. Another was serving in a major judicial office at the very time of his expulsion. The review was a reminder that rank and office did not place anyone beyond moral or political judgment. The censors were expected not merely to count citizens and supervise property, but to guard standards of conduct and public dignity. The consuls, meanwhile, performed their vows on the capital and left for their provinces. One of them, Marcus Aemilius, was given an unusual assignment. In Venetia, among the people of Patavium, internal faction had escalated into open civil strife, and local envoys had asked for Roman help. Roman commissioners dealing with unrest in Aetolia had already made clear that such disturbances could become unmanageable if left to themselves. In Patavium, however, the consul's arrival was enough. His presence restored order before the conflict could widen further. With nothing else demanding his attention in that province, he soon returned to Rome. It was a small but revealing example of Roman authority. Sometimes a campaign required a siege and a battle. Sometimes it required only the visible weight of consular power. The censors, for their part, left a deep mark on the city itself. They were the first to contract for the paving of Rome's streets with stone. Roads beyond the city were to be surfaced with gravel and properly edged. Bridges were to be built in many places. They ordered the construction of a stage for the use of the idols and praetors during public performances. In the circus, they provided starting gates, lap counters marked with eggs, turning posts, and iron cages from which wild beasts could be released during spectacles. They also undertook works linked to the great festivals of the Alban Mount. The ascent from the Forum to the Capitol was paved with stone, and a colonnade was built running from the Temple of Saturn toward the Capitol and onward in the direction of the main political buildings. Markets were paved and enclosed. Existing porticos were repaired. Steps were built from the Tiber up to the trading area. Roads inside the city were improved, and a colonnade was raised along one of the important streets leading toward the Temple of Venus. Their activity extended beyond Rome itself. Contracts were issued for walls around Calatia and Auximum. The revenue from public leases was used to surround both forums with shops. These were not minor embellishments. they were improvements that reshaped how movement, trade, performance, and public life functioned in the city and beyond it. Yet the two censors did not behave identically. Postumius declared that he would not spend on anything unless it had been directly ordered by the Senate or the Roman people. Fulvius Flaccus took a more expansive approach. He used public funds for temples, road paving, water supply works, drains, town walls, porticos, and even statuary in several colonies. At Pisorum and Fundi, he sponsored temples to Jupiter. At Potentia, he arranged for an aqueduct. At Sinuessa, he ordered drains installed, walls built around the town, and the forum enclosed with porticos and shops. He also commissioned 3 statues of Janus. The colonists in these places were deeply grateful for the improvements. At the same time, the censorship was severe in moral discipline. Many men were stripped of equestrian rank. This was not a mild or ceremonial oversight. It was a stern and active censorship that aimed to shape both the fabric of the state and the conduct of its leading citizens. As the year moved toward its close, public religion once again marked Rome's response to events abroad and disasters at home. A day of thanksgiving was ordered for the success achieved in Spain under Appius Claudius, and sacrifices were performed in recognition of that victory. On another occasion, there was a public supplication at the temple of Ceres, Liber, and Libera after news arrived from Sabine territory that a powerful earthquake had brought down many buildings. Military success and natural catastrophe alike called for ritual acknowledgement. The Romans did not sharply separate divine favour, public security, and the management of political life. All belonged to the same order of responsibility. When Appius Claudius returned from Spain, the Senate granted him the right to enter the city in ovation. It was a lesser honour than a full triumph, but still a clear public recognition of military success. At the same time, elections for the coming year were approaching, and the contest for the consulship was intense, because many candidates sought the office. In the end, Lucius Postumius Albinus and Marcus Popilius Laenus were chosen. Then new praetors were elected, some entering office for the first time and others returning to it. Once these elections had been completed, Appius Claudius Centho celebrated his ovation over the Celtiberians as he came into the city. Considerable amounts of silver and gold were carried into the public treasury. The honour marked not only his battlefield success, but the larger Roman expectation that victory must be translated into visible benefit for the state. That same year, another public memorial was set up, this one in the temple of Mater Matuta. It recorded the achievements of Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus in Sardinia. According to the inscription, a Roman legion and army under his command had subdued the island, killed or captured more than 80,000 enemies, restored the freedom of Rome's allies there, and reimposed tribute. Once his duty had been completed, he had brought his army home, safe, intact, and rich with spoils. For that reason he'd entered Rome in triumph for a second time and dedicated the monument to Jupiter. The tablet also displayed a map of Sardinia and images of the battles. It was not simply a record. It was a visual statement of conquest, order restored, and Roman power made permanent in memory through text and image. Public entertainment too continued to grow in scale. There were several gladiatorial shows during the year, but one in particular stood out. Titus Flamininus, honouring the memory of his father, staged games that lasted 4 days. They included a banquet, sacrificial feasting, and theatrical performances, making the event as much a public display of family status as an act of memorial devotion. The climax of the spectacle was the gladiatorial combat itself. 74 fighters appeared over the course of 3 days, an impressive number for the period. Such shows were still developing in scale and popularity, but they were already becoming a powerful part of Roman public culture, combining piety, social ambition, violence, and display into a single form of civic theatre. At the opening of the year, when Lucius Postumius Albinus and Marcus Popilius Laenas entered the consulship, the Senate turned immediately to the question of provinces, armies, and the gathering storm beyond Italy. Both consuls were assigned to Liguria, a sign that Rome still regarded the north as unstable enough to require its highest magistrates in the field. They were ordered to raise powerful forces. Each was to enroll 2 fresh Roman legions, together with 10,000 infantry and 600 cavalry from the Latin and Italian allies. Reinforcements were also approved for Spain, where additional Roman infantry and cavalry were to be sent, and further troops were assigned for the praetor, who would go to Sardinia and then cross over to Corsica to conduct operations there. Until that transfer was complete, Sardinia would remain in the hands of Marcus Petilius. The praetors then drew their responsibilities in the usual way. One took the city's internal jurisdiction, another the cases involving Romans and foreigners, while others received nearer Spain, farther Spain, Sicily, and Sardinia. Rome was distributing authority across the Mediterranean. But behind these formal arrangements lay a growing awareness that a far larger conflict might soon overshadow all the rest. Before the magistrates departed, another matter was placed in the hands of Lucius Postumius. The Senate decided that he should go to Campania to investigate the boundaries between public land and private property, because it had become widely known that certain individuals had gradually extended their holdings into land that belonged to the state, and were now treating it as their own. This was the kind of issue that could easily appear technical, but in Rome it was never merely technical. Land, power, law, and privilege were inseparable. Yet Postumius was not a man inclined to handle authority with restraint. He had long held a grudge against the people of Praeneste, who had failed, in his opinion, to honour him properly when he had once visited their shrine of Fortuna as a private citizen. Before even leaving Rome, he sent orders ahead to the town, demanding that its chief magistrate meet him on the road, arrange lodging for him at public expense, and provide pack animals for his onward journey. That demand marked a change in the tone of Roman rule, and not a welcome one. Until then, magistrates had generally not treated allied communities as personal sources of comfort and supply. They were equipped officially with transport, tents, and the necessities of travel precisely so that they would not burden the allies. Hospitality did exist, but it was meant to be reciprocal, gracious, and voluntary. Roman officials accepted private courtesy while travelling and later repaid it at Rome when those same hosts came there. In urgent circumstances, an envoy might request a single mule from a town along the way, but demands beyond that had not been treated as normal. Even if Postumius had reason for resentment, the consulship was not supposed to be used to settle private insults. Yet the quiet compliance of the people of Praeneste, whether born from caution or fear, only helped create a dangerous precedent. By yielding, they seemed to legitimize burdens that Roman magistrates had not previously claimed as a right. At the beginning of that same year, ambassadors who had recently returned from Aetolia and Macedonia gave their reports. They said they had been unable to meet Perseus. Some had been told he was away, others that he was ill, but both explanations were plainly evasions. What mattered was not the excuse, but the impression left behind. Military preparations were clearly underway, and the king no longer seemed interested in postponing war. The envoys also described worsening factional violence in Aetolia, where internal strife was deepening day by day, and Roman authority had failed to bring the main instigators under control. The atmosphere surrounding Rome was changing. Unrest in Greece, evasiveness in Macedonia, and the visible preparations of Perseus all suggested that the Republic was moving toward a major eastern conflict. Because war with Macedonia now seemed increasingly likely, the Senate decided that the state must first make peace with the gods. Every reported prodigy was to be expiated, and the prescribed prayers from the sacred books were to be used before any great war began. The signs that had recently been reported were numerous and strange. At Lanuvium, people claimed to have seen in the sky the likeness of an immense fleet. At Privernum, dark wool was said to have sprung from the earth. In the territory near Vai, there had been a shower of stones. The Pomptine district was said to have been overwhelmed by locusts in such numbers that they seemed like storm clouds. In Gallic territory, fish were reportedly turned up in freshly ploughed soil. These were not treated as curiosities. The sacred books were consulted, and the priestly board determined which sacrifices should be offered to which gods. Public supplications were decreed, along with renewed prayers for the health of the people and a religious festival. All was carried out according to written instruction, because in moments like these, Rome believed that exact ritual observance was part of its defence. That same year brought an act of sacrilege that shocked the Senate. Quintus Fulvius Flaccus, while serving as censor, was building a temple to Fortuna Equestris, a shrine he had vowed years earlier during his fighting in Spain. Competitive pride had seized him. He wanted his new temple to be larger and more splendid than any other in Rome, and he decided that marble roof tiles would give it unmatched magnificence. With that in mind, he went south to Bruttium and stripped half the roof from the temple of Juno Licinia, one of the most revered sanctuaries in the region. He had calculated that what he removed would be enough to cover his own building. Ships were already standing by to carry the tiles away, and his authority as censor was enough to keep the allies too frightened to resist this violation. When Fulvius returned to Rome, the tiles were unloaded and carried to his temple. Although there had been an effort to keep their origin unspoken, the truth could not remain hidden. The Curia erupted. All sides demanded that the consuls bring the matter formally before the Senate. When the censor appeared, he was attacked with bitter force. Men accused him of despoiling one of the holiest temples in Italy, a sanctuary that neither Pyrrhus nor Hannibal had dared to violate. He had not merely borrowed decoration, he had torn open the roof, exposed the structure beneath to weather and decay, and left a sacred building effectively mutilated. The outrage was sharpened by the irony of his office. A censor was supposed to oversee public morality and ensure the care of sacred places, not wander through allied lands damaging temples and stripping them for ornament. The charge against him was larger than theft. It was that he had tried to beautify one Roman temple by desecrating another, as if the gods worshipped by allies were somehow lesser than those worshipped at Rome. The Senate's mood was clear even before the vote was taken. It was unanimously decided that the tiles must be carried back and restored, and that sacrifices must be made to appease Juno. The expiatory rites were performed with care. Yet when the tiles were returned, the contractors reported that they had been left within the temple precinct because no craftsman could discover how to fix them back into place. The damage done in arrogance could not simply be undone by decree. The religious offence had been acknowledged, but the temple itself remained visibly wounded. Elsewhere that year, events in the provinces continued. Numerius Fabius, one of the praetors assigned abroad, died at Massilia while on his way to nearer Spain. When the news reached Rome, the Senate decided that the two men already holding command in Spain should cast lots to determine which one would remain with extended authority. The result favoured Publius Furius, who stayed on in the province he had already governed. In the same period, the Senate also decreed that land recently captured in Ligurian and Gallic territory should be divided up, since large stretches of it still lay empty. The urban praetor appointed a commission of 10 men to oversee the work. Roman citizens were each given 10 augura, while the Latin allies received 3. It was another example of how conquest turned into settlement, and how military success was translated into a remaking of landholding and population. At the same time, fresh embassies arrived at Rome from Aetolia and Thessaly. The Aetolians brought more reports of internal quarrels and renewed upheaval. The Thessalians came with news from the Macedonian world, where tension was rising steadily. Perseus, for his part, was clearly turning over in his mind the war that his father Philip had once planned but had not lived to carry out. Through embassies, promises, and gestures of favour, he was making himself agreeable to Greek cities and peoples across the region, even when those promises remained largely words. A considerable portion of public opinion, especially outside the circles most tied to Rome, leaned toward him. In fact, many seem to have found him more appealing than Eumenes, despite all that Eumenes had done for Greek cities through gifts, benefactions, and careful rule. The cities under Eumenes' control were generally well governed and had little reason to desire change, yet Perseus still stirred imaginations and sympathies in a way that was hard to explain purely by policy. His personal reputation did not justify such affection. Stories followed him everywhere, darkening his image. It was said that after his father's death, he had killed his own wife with his own hand. It was also said that one of the men who had once assisted him in the murder of his brother, a man who had first fled and later returned expecting reward, had in turn been secretly eliminated by Perseus. Alongside these tales were broader accusations of multiple killings, both among Macedonians and foreigners. He was not known for justice, generosity, or any especially admirable quality. Yet many cities still preferred him to Eumenes, a king who had shown loyalty to family, fairness towards subjects, and generosity to others. The explanation may have lain in the old prestige of the Macedonian monarchy, still surrounded by grandeur and memory, while the kingdom of Pergamum seemed newer and perhaps less majestic. Or perhaps people simply longed for altered circumstances. Or perhaps they feared, beneath everything else, the growing reach of Rome and did not wish all political roads to end there. Debt was also helping to poison relations throughout parts of Greece. The Aetolians were not alone in being driven into internal conflict by crushing financial burdens. Thessaly suffered from the same disease, and the problem had spread into Perabia as well. When news reached Rome that Thessaly had taken up arms, Appius Claudius was sent to assess the situation and restore order. He first rebuked the leaders on both sides, then attacked the heart of the problem. With the creditors accepting terms, especially those who had loaded their loans with excessive and unfair interest, he reduced the burden of debt and arranged for the legally owed sums to be paid off over 10 years in installments. He settled matters in Perabia in much the same way. The Roman intervention here was not military conquest, but political surgery, an attempt to calm societies whose factionalism had become inseparable from financial desperation. Meanwhile, at Delphi, Marcus Marcellus heard the opposing Aetolian parties argue their cases with all the bitterness they had shown in civil war itself. He quickly saw that both sides were matched not only in energy but in recklessness and shamelessness. Rather than issue a ruling that would lighten the burden for one side or increase it for the other, he sought something simpler and harder: that they stop fighting, settle their disputes, and leave the matter behind. To strengthen confidence in this arrangement, hostages were exchanged by mutual agreement and placed at Corinth. It was peace held together not by trust, but by shared fear of losing what each side valued most. After Delphi, Marcellus crossed over to Aegium in the Peloponnese and convened a meeting with the Achaeans. There, he praised them for continuing to uphold their old decree that excluded Macedonian kings from crossing into their territory. At the same time, he made clear the depth of Roman hostility toward Perseus. Eumenes then came to Rome, eager to intensify that hostility. He brought with him a carefully assembled account of Perseus's military preparations, hoping to persuade the Senate that the danger was no longer theoretical. In response, 5 Roman ambassadors were sent to Macedonia to examine conditions for themselves. They were also instructed to continue on to Alexandria and renew Rome's alliance with Ptolemy. The diplomatic web was widening. Rome was no longer merely reacting to news. It was actively positioning itself before war formally began. Around the same time, envoys arrived from Antiochus. Their spokesman explained the delay in payment of tribute and assured the Senate that the full amount had now been brought so that no special concession need be asked beyond a grace period. He also presented a gift of gold vessels and declared that the king wished to renew for himself the same alliance and treaty that had existed with his father. Antiochus, he said, was ready to fulfill whatever duty was required of a good and loyal ally. He asked only that Rome treat him accordingly. The envoy also reminded the Senate how honourably Antiochus had once been treated at Rome, where he had been received with such courtesy that he was regarded not as a hostage, but as a king. The embassy was received favourably. The alliance was renewed, the tribute accepted, the gold vessels taken into public care, and the envoy himself rewarded generously and lodged at public expense while he remained in Italy. Reports from Syria had already indicated that he was highly regarded by the king and inclined in a friendly direction toward Rome. In a moment of rising tension with Macedonia, this friendly eastern relationship mattered. The provincial campaigns of the year continued without pause. In Corsica, the praetor Gaius Cittireus fought a pitched battle in which many Corsicans were killed and a large number taken prisoner. During the fighting, he vowed a temple to Juno Moneta. The Corsicans then sued for peace and were assessed an enormous tribute in wax. Having imposed submission on the island, Cittireus crossed over to Sardinia. Meanwhile, in Liguria, serious fighting took place near Carystus, a town in the territory of the Statelates. A large Ligurian force had gathered there. When the consul, Marcus Petilius, first approached, the Ligures stayed inside the town, but once they realized he was preparing to attack the place itself, they came out and formed for battle before the gates. That was exactly what he had hoped to force them into doing. The battle that followed was hard and prolonged. For more than 3 hours, neither side could break the other. The Ligurian standards held firm across the line, and the consul saw that his infantry alone was not going to shake them. So he ordered the cavalry to mount and launch a simultaneous 3-pronged push, meant to throw the enemy into confusion from multiple directions at once. A strong mounted force broke through the centre, drove behind the Ligurian ranks and triggered panic. Once fear spread, the line dissolved. The Ligures fled in every direction. Roman cavalry concentrated especially on blocking the route back into the town, and only a few slipped through. Many had already fallen in the long struggle, and many more were killed in the chaotic retreat. The losses reported for the Ligures were immense, while Roman losses too were substantial. A reminder that even a clear victory could be dearly bought when the battle line had held stubbornly for so long. After the fighting, the scattered Ligures regrouped and surrendered. They knew their dead outnumbered the survivors, and that only a remnant remained. They did not bargain. They seem instead to have trusted that the consul would not treat them worse than other Roman commanders had treated defeated enemies in the past. That hope was shattered. Petilius disarmed them all, destroyed their town, and sold them and their possessions. Then he sent a letter to Rome announcing what he had done, as though it were a straightforward military success. The reaction in the Senate was one of shock. Because Lucius Postumius was occupied in Campania with the investigation of public and private land, the letter was read before the Senate by the urban praetor Aulus Atilius. The senators were appalled not only by the cruelty of what had happened, but by the precedent it threatened to establish. The Statelites had not been among the Ligurian peoples who had openly taken up arms, first against Rome. They had surrendered, placing themselves in Roman good faith. Yet after doing so, they had been stripped, broken, and sold into slavery in vast numbers. Men and women who had trusted Rome's word had been dispersed as property among those who only recently had been Rome's genuine enemies. The Senate saw this as intolerable. If surrender led to such treatment, then what people would ever again dare to lay down arms and entrust themselves to Roman mercy? For that reason, the Senate decreed that Marcus Petilius must return the money he had received from selling the Ligurs and free them. He was to make every effort to restore their property, recover what could be recovered, and return their weapons. He was not to leave his province until he had re-established in their own homes the people who had surrendered voluntarily. The decree also carried a moral rebuke. Victory, the Senate reminded him, drew its honour from overcoming armed enemies, not from abusing those who'd already submitted. It was one of those moments when Rome, however brutally it often acted, still insisted on a public distinction between conquest and treachery. Petilius reacted to this decision with the same violent temper he had shown in war. He placed his legions into winter quarters at Pisa and hurried back to Rome, furious both with the Senate and with the praetor who had introduced the matter. He immediately summoned the Senate to meet in the Temple of Bellona and launched a long attack on Aulus Atilius. Instead of asking the Senate to honour the gods for a major victory, he complained the praetor had produced a decree against a consul and in favour of the enemy. In Petilius's telling, his victory had effectively been handed over to the Ligurs, and the Senate had practically ordered him to submit himself to them. He demanded that the decree be revoked and replaced with a thanksgiving. If the Senate had wanted to honour the gods and show him even a minimum of respect, it should have done so when his letter first arrived. It should do so now, he argued, both for religion and for his own dignity. The Senate did not bend. Several members answered him as harshly in person as they had condemned him in absence. He left Rome having achieved nothing. The other consul, Postumius, spent the summer examining land claims in Campania and returned for the elections without ever having set foot in the province assigned to him in war. He then presided over the election of the next consuls and praetors. Public business moved on, but the anger over Liguria had not faded. A lustrum was held that year by the censors Quintus Fulvius Flaccus and Aulus Postumius Albinus. The censors counted 269,015 Roman citizens. The reduced figure was connected to the consul Lucius Postumius, public enforcement of an earlier rule requiring Latins who had returned to their home cities to be counted there rather than at Rome. In most respects, the census was conducted smoothly and to public benefit. The censors marked certain men as aerarii, removed others from their voting tribes, and acted in rare harmony, neither blocking the disciplinary decisions of the other. Fulvius also dedicated the temple of Fortuna Equestris, 7 years after vowing it in Spain, and celebrated the occasion with theatrical performances and games in the circus. That same year saw other notable events. A major priest died and was replaced. An enormous swarm of locusts arrived from the sea and smothered the fields of Apulia. The threat to agriculture was so severe that the incoming praetor Gnaeus Sicinius was specifically empowered to deal with it, and even with large manpower at his disposal, clearing the plague took considerable time. Thus, as one year ended and another began, the Roman state found itself dealing at once with moral scandal, provincial violence, natural disaster, religious duty, and the rising political struggle over Macedonia. At the opening of the following year, with Gaius Petilius and Publius Aelius now consuls, old disputes immediately returned. The Senate wanted to take up the Ligurian question again and renew the decree against Marcus Petilius. Aelius brought the matter forward. Gaius Petilius openly defended his brother and stated that he would veto any decree directed against him. His colleague was discouraged by that stance, but the senators themselves became only more determined. When the provinces were discussed, Macedonia was highly desirable because war with Perseus seemed close. Yet the Senate refused to grant it. Instead, both consuls were assigned once more to Liguria. They also refused to grant either consul new armies or reinforcements. The same denial met the praetors seeking extra troops for Spain. The Senate was making its point with complete clarity. As long as the matter of Marcus Petilius remained unresolved, it would not entrust greater commands to those defending him. The consuls reacted with anger. They set the Latin festival for the earliest possible day and announced that they were on the verge of leaving for their province, and that no public business would be conducted except what was necessary for provincial administration. The relationship between magistrates and Senate was badly strained. It was in this tense climate that one of the most important diplomatic arrivals of the period reached Rome. Some writers later claimed it was Attalus, brother of King Eumenes, who came as ambassador to accuse Perseus and reveal his war preparations. Most accounts, however, said that Eumenes himself came, and that is how the event was remembered above all. Eumenes was received with exceptional honour. Romans believed this treatment was owed, not only to his rank, but to the many services and acts of loyalty that had long bound him to them. When he was brought before the Senate, he explained that he had come not merely from personal desire to see the city, its gods, and the men whose favour had elevated his kingdom beyond anything once imaginable, but to warn Rome before Perseus's designs had gone too far. He began by recalling the plans of Philip. Demetrius, Philip's son, who had opposed war with Rome, had been murdered. The Bastarnae had been stirred from their lands as potential instruments in a march toward Italy. Philip had died while still contemplating that project and had left the throne to the son he knew to be most hostile to Rome. Perseus, Eumenes argued, had inherited not only the kingdom, but the war that Philip had left unfinished. From that point, Eumenes described Perseus as a king whose every thought had long been directed toward preparing and nourishing conflict. Macedonia, he said, was full of young men made strong by a long peace. The kingdom's resources were abundant. Perseus himself stood in the prime of life, physically vigorous and mentally seasoned by long exposure to warfare. As a boy, he had shared his father's campaigns, occupied his tent, and taken on missions not only in border fighting but even in the war against Rome itself. Since taking the throne, he had succeeded in accomplishing many things that Philip had once pursued with all kinds of force and cunning, but had failed to secure. His power, Eumenes warned, was no hollow inheritance. It had been expanded and reinforced by years of calculated favour and visible success. Eumenes then widened the picture. Across Greece and Asia, he said, cities held Perseus in awe. He admitted that he could not fully explain why. He could not point to any outstanding generosity or clear policy that justified so much admiration. Perhaps fortune had aided Perseus. Perhaps, though he was reluctant to say it openly, dislike of Roman power made the Macedonian king more attractive in the eyes of others. Even among kings his standing was high. He had married the daughter of Seleucus, not as a suitor pleading for advantage, but as a ruler sought after. He had given his own sister in marriage to Prusias, who had pressed eagerly for the match. These unions had been celebrated widely, and delegations from important peoples had joined the festivities, with gifts and public goodwill. He reminded the Senate too that even in Greece, Perseus' influence had advanced markedly. Philip had once tried and failed to secure the Boeotians by treaty. Yet under Perseus, their alliance had been publicly inscribed in places of major religious and political importance. In Achaea, Eumenes suggested, only a few men had prevented the opening from going much further. He contrasted this with his own position. The honours once granted him by Greek communities, despite all the public and personal services he had performed, had in many places lapsed through neglect and in others been removed out of hostility. In Aetolia, he said, during their own internal conflict, men had turned to Perseus instead of to Rome. The trend was unmistakable. Yet, Eumenes insisted, Perseus did not depend solely on friendships and alliances abroad. His preparations at home were so complete that outside support was almost unnecessary. He had gathered provisions sufficient, it was said, to sustain 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry for 10 years. His treasury was rich enough not only to maintain Macedonian troops, but to pay 10,000 mercenaries for the same length of time. And this did not even include the yearly yield of the royal mines. His arsenals contained equipment for multiple armies, and beyond Macedonia itself stood Thrace, a reservoir of manpower he could draw on, as though it were a spring that never ran dry. This was the image Eumenes wanted Rome to see. Not an isolated king making threats, but a ruler whose diplomacy, military resources, prestige, and strategic patience had already brought him close to becoming the centre of a much wider coalition. He ended not merely with information, but with warning. These were not rumours repeated carelessly, he said, nor accusations coloured by private hatred. He presented them as findings carefully gathered, as if by a man sent to observe with his own eyes. He had not crossed the sea and left his own kingdom behind in order to destroy his credibility by telling invented stories. What he had seen was a world shifting. Great cities in Asia and Greece were revealing their inclinations more openly with every passing day. And if this continued unchecked, they would reach a point from which return would be difficult. Perseus, he said, was not confining himself within the borders of Macedonia. Some communities he had already bent by force. Others, too strong to be taken that way, he was drawing in through favour, courtesy, and calculated kindness. The danger, in Eumenes' view, was not merely that Perseus was preparing for war. It was that he was preparing the political world around him to welcome it. Eumenes closed his warning by pointing to what he believed was the most dangerous imbalance of all. While Perseus was steadily moving toward a war, Rome was still extending to him the outward safety of peace. To Eumenes, that contrast was alarming. It seemed to him that Perseus was no longer merely gathering strength for some distant conflict, but already acting as though the struggle had begun. One after another, men and communities tied to Rome had been struck. Brutality, a ruler friendly to Rome, had been driven from his kingdom. An Illyrian leader connected to Rome had been killed once Perseus discovered that messages were passing to the Romans. In Boeotia, prominent men who had spoken too freely against him and threatened to report his activities were removed. The Byzantines had received his support in a manner that disregarded Rome's agreements. The Dolopes had been attacked. In Thessaly and Doris, he had entered with his army under the pretext of helping the lower orders. Yet, in reality, he was using social tension to break the influence of the leading families. In Thessaly and Perihebia, he spread confusion everywhere by encouraging the hope that debts would be cancelled, undermining the wealthy and powerful, while binding the common people to himself through gratitude and dependence. To Eumenes, all of this added up to a single conclusion. Perseus had come to believe that Greece had effectively been abandoned to him. Since Rome had watched these moves without striking back, he assumed there would be no armed resistance before he reached Italy itself. Eumenes left it to the Senate to decide how safe or honourable such a situation truly was. But he made clear what he felt. In his eyes, It was deeply shameful that Perseus might arrive in Italy in arms, before an ally could arrive in time to warn Rome of the danger. He had done what duty required. He had crossed the sea, spoken plainly, and discharged the obligation he owed to Rome and to his own kingdom. Beyond that, he said, little remained except to pray that the gods would guide Rome to protect itself, its allies, and its friends before the balance of power shifted too far. The speech left the Senate unsettled, yet the discussion that followed remained hidden behind the closed silence of the Curia. At the time, almost no one outside knew more than that Eumenes had been there. Only much later, after war had finally run its course, did fragments of his words and the Roman response begin to circulate. A few days afterward, ambassadors from Perseus were admitted. But by then, the atmosphere had already been shaped by what Eumenes had said. The king's representatives arrived too late to find neutral minds. Their apologies, denials, and requests found little sympathy among men who had already begun to imagine Perseus, not as an uncertain partner in a fragile peace, but as a coming enemy. What made matters worse was the tone adopted by Harpalus, the leading envoy. Rather than approach the Senate with care, he spoke with a confidence that many found offensive. He insisted that Perseus longed to be believed when he said he had never acted with hostile intent. Yet, in the same breath, he warned that if Rome insisted on searching relentlessly for a pretext for war, the king would meet that danger boldly. He ended with a remark that was remembered because it grated so sharply on Roman ears. War, he said, was an impartial thing, and its outcome was never certain. It was the kind of language that might have suited equals, speaking across an already hostile frontier. Spoken at Rome, in a Senate already stirred by suspicion, it only confirmed the sense that Perseus's court had grown too confident and too careless. Across Greece and Asia, all eyes were now fixed on what had been said in Rome by Eumenes and by the Macedonian envoys. The effect was immediate. The arrival of Eumenes encouraged many cities to send delegations of their own, sometimes claiming other motives, but in reality waiting to see whether his presence would bring some major change in Roman policy. One of the most heated responses came from Rhodes. The leading man of the Rhodian embassy was hot-blooded, unwilling to conceal his feelings, and convinced that Eumenes had dragged Rhodes into his accusations against Perseus. Counting on the support of his hosts and personal connections, he pressed in every way he could for the chance to confront the king before the Senate itself. He failed to secure that opportunity, and frustration overcame his judgment. He launched instead into a fierce and uncontrolled attack on Eumenes, accusing him of stirring the Lycians against Rhodes and of making himself more burdensome to Asia than Antiochus had ever been. The speech may have found some sympathy among ordinary listeners in parts of Asia, where Eumenes was not universally loved and where Perseus, too, had begun to attract goodwill. But in the Senate, it was received badly. Rather than diminish Roman affection for Eumenes, it strengthened it. The more openly others revealed their resentment toward him, the more determined Rome became to show him honour. He was showered with distinctions and magnificent gifts, among them the symbols of high dignity that only increased the contrast between him and the hostile voices raised against him. What had been intended as an attack on his standing ended by enlarging it. As soon as the embassies were dismissed, Harpalus hurried back to Macedonia. His message to Perseus was plain. Rome had not yet openly set its armies in motion, but the mood had turned so sharply that delay couldn't last much longer. Perseus himself was not dismayed. He had expected this moment, and in some ways he now wanted it. He believed his power had reached its height, and he was eager to act before circumstances shifted against him. More than any other rival, he hated Eumenes. He decided that the king of Pergamum should become the first casualty of the war, before the war itself had formally begun. The plan he devised was an act of political murder, disguised as chance violence. Perseus entrusted it to one of his allied commanders, a Cretan named Evander, assisted by 3 Macedonians accustomed to brutal tasks of this kind. They carried a letter to a wealthy and well-connected woman at Delphi named Praxo, who was linked to Perseus by ties of guest friendship. Everyone knew that Eumenes intended to travel to Delphi to sacrifice to Apollo. The assassins arrived ahead of him and carefully examined the route, looking for the best place to strike. Along the steep ascent from the coast toward the sanctuary, before the path narrowed among the buildings, there was a section where a stone wall ran beside the track. The passage there was so tight that travellers were forced into single file. On the opposite side, a landslide had left a steep drop. The killers hid behind the wall and even built steps there so they could rise above the path and attack from higher ground. When Eumenes began the climb from the sea, he was surrounded by a crowd of attendants and friends. But as the path narrowed, the group stretched out into a long line. Near the critical point, a distinguished Aetolian named Pantaleon, who had been speaking with the king, moved ahead along the track. That was the moment the attackers chose. They sprang up and sent down 2 enormous stones. One struck Eumenes on the head, the other on the shoulder. The blows hurled him from the path, and he collapsed down the slope under a heap of rock and earth. His companions panicked at the sight and fled, but Pantaleon did not abandon him. He remained behind and stood guard over the fallen king while the rest scattered. The assassins had every chance to complete the murder. They could easily have come around the wall and descended to finish off the wounded man. Instead, they fled toward the heights of Parnassus as though the deed were already accomplished. Their retreat was hurried and confused. One of them began to slow the escape because of the rough and pathless climb, and his companions killed him rather than risk his capture and possible confession. The contrast was striking. The plot had been prepared with careful thought and boldness, yet in the moment after the attack, those carrying it out showed fear and disorder rather than discipline. Meanwhile, Eumenes' attendants and friends began to gather around him again. When they lifted him, they discovered that although he was unconscious and stunned, he was still warm and still breathing. The hope of survival seemed faint, almost non-existent, but it had not vanished. Some of the attendants tried to pursue the assassins up the mountain, only to return exhausted and empty-handed after a fruitless climb. The Macedonians had shown daring in launching the attempt, but clumsiness and cowardice in abandoning it. By the very next day, Eumenes had regained his senses. His friends moved him to a ship and carried him first to Corinth. The vessel was hauled across the isthmus and continued on to Aegina. There, he was hidden away and treated in strict secrecy. So carefully was his condition concealed that a rumour spread through Asia that he was dead. That rumour brought out an unseemly response from his brother Attalus. Believing the report too quickly and acting with a haste that later seemed difficult to defend, he began addressing Eumenes' wife and the commander of the palace guard as though the kingdom had already passed into his hands. The news of this behaviour eventually reached Eumenes. At first, he seems to have considered keeping silent and pretending not to know. But when the brothers finally met, he could not restrain himself. He reproached Attalus for turning toward his wife and his inheritance with indecent speed. The attempt on his life thus left wounds not only between kingdoms, but within his own household. The false report of his death reached Rome as well, and there too it heightened the sense that the Mediterranean world was entering a far darker phase. At about the same time, Gaius Valerius returned from Greece. He had gone as an envoy to examine conditions there and to learn what Perseus was planning. Everything he reported matched the accusations Eumenes had made. He also brought with him new witnesses. One was Praxo of Delphi, whose house had sheltered the men behind the attempt on Eumenes. The other was Lucius Ramius of Brundisium, a wealthy and prominent man whose testimony proved even more disturbing. Ramius was known for hosting Roman generals, envoys, and important foreign visitors, especially those linked with royal courts. Through these habits of hospitality, he had first become connected indirectly with Perseus. Then a letter arrived, promising closer friendship and enormous rewards, and Ramius allowed himself to be drawn into a direct visit. Once there, he quickly found himself treated as an intimate, and gradually pulled into conversations he had never wanted to hear. Perseus promised him rich rewards and then began to propose something far more sinister. Since Roman commanders and envoys often stayed under Ramius's roof, the king suggested that he poison whichever of them Perseus named. The king had already thought through the method. He pointed out that ordinary poisoning carried risks. Too many people might become involved. The poison might fail, it might leave traces, it might be discovered too soon. Perseus, however, claimed he could provide a substance that would work without leaving any sign either during the act or after it. Ramius was terrified. He feared that refusal might make him the first subject on whom the poison was tested. So he pretended to agree, secured permission to leave, and set out for Brundisium. He did not go straight home. Instead, he first sought out Gaius Valerius, who was said to be near Chalcis, and laid the whole plot before him. Valerius then brought him to Rome. Once admitted to the Senate, Ramius repeated everything. This testimony, coming on top of Eumenes' warning and Valerius's own observations, removed much of the hesitation that still remained. The Senate no longer saw Perseus merely as a king preparing for war in the ordinary way. He now appeared as a man willing to operate by ambush, murder, and poison. The political argument for war was now reinforced by moral revulsion. Responsibility for the coming struggle was left to the incoming consuls. But even before a formal declaration, Rome began acting. The praetor Gnaeus Sicinius, whose normal duties concerned jurisdiction involving Romans and foreigners, was ordered to raise troops at once and march them to Brundisium. From there, they were to cross to Apollonia in Epirus and secure the coastal cities. The reasoning was practical. Whoever among the future consuls received Macedonia as his province would need a safe place to land with the fleet and disembark the army. Rome was already setting the first stones of invasion in place before officially naming the enemy. Eumenes, meanwhile, remained at Aegina for a considerable time while recovering from his injuries. The process was difficult and uncertain, but once he was strong enough, he returned to Pergamum. Far from softening his attitude, the attempt on his life rekindled every hostility he had long felt toward Perseus. Roman envoys later came to congratulate him on having escaped such grave danger. The gesture mattered. It signalled that Rome not only believed his story, but recognised him now as a man whose personal survival had become entangled with the larger struggle against Macedonia. Because the war with Perseus had been postponed for one more year, some of the practical business of empire continued alongside the mounting crisis. By this time, most of the praetors had already gone out to their provinces, but the men assigned to Spain renewed their plea for reinforcements. At last, they secured what they wanted. Additional Roman infantry and cavalry were ordered for the legions, and allied troops were added to their forces as well. These fresh units were sent to Spain together with the new praetors. Even as attention shifted eastward, Rome could not neglect the burdens of its western provinces. In Italy itself, another important issue was emerging from the earlier investigation into Campanian land. Lucius Postumius had recovered a significant amount of territory that private individuals had quietly absorbed into their own holdings. In response, a tribune of the plebs proposed a law requiring the censors to lease this land out for cultivation. For many years since the fall of Capua, this had not been done, and greed had flourished in the absence of oversight. The measure was an attempt to restore order where neglect had created opportunity for the powerful. Although war had still not been formally declared, the decision in principle had already been taken, and Rome was watching closely to see which rulers would align themselves with the Republic and which would incline toward Perseus. At this point, ambassadors arrived from King Ariarathes, bringing with them his young son. They explained that the boy had been sent to Rome to be educated there from childhood, so that he might grow up familiar with the Romans and their customs. The king asked not only that friends of his be entrusted with the child's care, but that Rome itself treat him almost as a ward of the state. The embassy was warmly received. The gesture was politically intelligent and symbolically powerful. The Senate was pleased, and the praetor was instructed to arrange a house where the prince and his companions could live. Envoys from certain Thracian tribes were also granted formal friendship and alliance, along with gifts. Their arrival caused particular satisfaction because Thrace lay to the rear of Macedonia. At the same time, Rome sent additional envoys eastward to Crete and Rhodes. Their task was not only to renew alliances, but to observe quietly whether Perseus had been working on the minds of Rome's allies. The diplomatic struggle was now fully underway. War had not yet been proclaimed, but the contest for loyalty, influence, and position had already begun in earnest. Then came another sign that fed the atmosphere of fear and expectation. During a violent night storm, lightning struck and destroyed the rostral column on the Capitol, a monument that had stood since the First Punic War to commemorate an earlier Roman naval victory. In a city already tense with anticipation of war, the event was instantly treated as a portent and reported to the Senate. The response was immediate. The matter was referred both to the haruspices and to the keepers of the sacred books. The latter declared that the city needed ceremonial purification, public supplication, and sacrifice. Full-grown victims were to be offered both on the Capitol at Rome and on the promontory of Minerva in Campania. A 10-day festival for Jupiter Optimus Maximus was also to be held at the first possible opportunity. All of it was carried out with care. The interpreters of signs then offered a reassuring reading. The omen, they said, would prove favourable. It signalled the enlargement of Roman territory and the destruction of enemies, because the prows cast down by the storm were themselves old enemy spoils. But the city's mood remained anxious, especially as other prodigies were reported. At Saturnia, blood was said to have reigned in the marketplace for 3 successive days. At Calatia, a donkey was born with 3 legs, and a bull together with 5 cows was killed by a single lightning stroke. At Auximum, earth reportedly fell from the sky. Each of these signs prompted further rites, another day of supplication, and a public holiday. Religion, fear, and politics moved forward together. Even now, the consuls hadn't yet left for their province, because they still refused to comply with the Senate's desire to reopen the case of Marcus Petilius, while the Senate in turn refused to settle other important matters first. Resentment toward Petilius grew even stronger when dispatches arrived, announcing that, as proconsul, he had fought the Ligurian statelates once again and killed 6,000 of them. This fresh and unjustified campaign against a people already surrendered pushed the rest of Liguria toward revolt. The Senate reacted with outrage, not only against the absent Petilius, who had violated both law and good faith, but also against the consuls who still had not gone to their province. 2 tribunes of the plebs, encouraged by the unanimous mood of the Senate, warned that they would fine the consuls unless they departed. They also read aloud the measure they intended to bring against the treatment of the Ligurs. It provided that if the defeated statelates had not been restored to freedom by the 1st of August, a sworn senatorial inquiry must be established, to find and punish those responsible for their malicious enslavement. Once the Senate had backed them, the tribunes formally introduced the measure. Before the consuls left, Gaius Cicereus, who had been praetor the previous year, was admitted to the Senate in the Temple of Bologna and recounted what he had achieved in Corsica. When his request for a triumph was refused, he celebrated one instead, on the Alban Mount, following a substitute custom used when public authorization was withheld. The people approved the tribunes' measure on the Ligures by a nearly unanimous vote. In accordance with it, the praetor Gaius Licinius asked the Senate whom it wanted to conduct the investigation, and the senators chose him. Only then did the consuls finally depart and take over the army from Marcus Petilius. Petilius himself did not dare return to Rome. He knew that he might face trial before a hostile Senate and an even angrier public, and before the very praetor now charged with pursuing the Ligurian matter. The tribunes answered his refusal by announcing a second measure. If he did not come back before the 13th of November, Gaius Licinius would judge and sentence him in his absence. Pressed on all sides, Petilius returned. He entered the Senate surrounded by resentment. There he was attacked savagely by many speakers, and a decree was passed, assigning the praetors Gaius Licinius and Gnaeus Caecinius to free those Ligures who had not been in arms since an earlier consulship, and to see that they were resettled. Gaius Petilius, now consul, was ordered to grant them land on the far side of the Po. Thousands were eventually freed, moved across the river, and settled there. Yet Petilius still managed to avoid real punishment. He stood trial before Gaius Licinius for 2 days, but on the 3rd, the praetor delayed the final hearing until the 15th of March, the day when new magistrates would enter office and he himself would return to private status. By that manoeuvre, the legal threat was effectively neutralized. At the same time, another dispute of great importance unfolded in Rome, this time between Carthage and Massinissa. Ambassadors from Carthage and Gulussa, son of Massinissa, appeared before the Senate and argued fiercely. The Carthaginians complained that in addition to lands previously examined by Roman envoys, Massinissa had seized more than 70 towns and strongholds in the last 2 years. He had done so boldly and without scruple, while Carthage, bound by treaty, had not dared retaliate. They said they were forbidden to wage war outside their own territory, and were further restrained by the clause that forbade them to make war on Rome's allies. Yet Massinissa's arrogance, cruelty, and greed, they declared, had now become intolerable. They begged the Senate for one of 3 things: either a fair determination of what belonged to each side, or permission to defend themselves in limited warfare, or, if Rome intended simply to favour Massinissa, then a final clear declaration of how much of Carthaginian land was to be given away. Better, they said, even to endure Roman domination than to live at the pleasure of a savage king. As they spoke, they broke down, fell to the ground, and stirred both pity for themselves and anger toward Massinissa. The Senate then called on Gulussa to answer. He replied cautiously. He said he had no specific instructions from his father on these points, especially since the Carthaginians had concealed their own embassy and intentions. Their leaders, he said, had met secretly at night in the temple of Aesculapius, and revealed almost nothing except that they were sending envoys to Rome with hidden instructions. That was why Massinissa had sent him, to ask the Senate not to trust accusations from enemies who hated the king precisely because of his unwavering loyalty to Rome. After hearing both sides, the Senate declined to settle the matter immediately. Gulussa was told to return and ask his father to send envoys quickly to Rome. The Carthaginians too were to return for a formal contest of claims. Rome made its position clear. It would honour Massinissa in every way it properly could, but it would not let favouritism replace justice. The Senate did not wish to create new frontiers, but to respect old ones. It had left the defeated Carthaginians their city and lands. It had not meant to license new seizures in peacetime. Both parties were then dismissed with the customary gifts and courtesies. Soon afterward, another Roman embassy returned from Macedonia. These envoys had been sent to demand satisfaction from Perseus, and effectively to renounce the existing relationship with him. Their report further inflamed the Senate, which by now needed little encouragement. They had seen with their own eyes that military preparations were advancing at full speed in every Macedonian town. When they first reached the king, they were repeatedly denied access. Only after giving up hope and already departing were they called back and admitted. Their message had been direct. A treaty had once been made with Philip and then renewed with Perseus after Philip's death. That treaty expressly forbade the king to carry arms beyond his own borders and to attack allies of the Roman people. The envoys reviewed the same accusations earlier set out by Eumenes, adding that Perseus had also held prolonged private meetings at Samothrace with delegations from the cities of Asia. Their final position was clear. Perseus must make satisfaction for these violations and restore whatever he held in defiance of Rome and its allies. By this stage, the pattern was unmistakable. Diplomacy, reports, omens, criminal plots, border wars, and the anxieties of allies all pointed in the same direction. War was no longer a distant possibility waiting to be imagined. It was a reality advancing through speeches, embassies, and preparations before armies had even formally met in the field. Rome had not yet made the final proclamation, but the world around it had already begun to move, as though the great struggle with Perseus had started. Perseus did not attempt to conceal his anger when the Roman envoys delivered their demands. His reaction was immediate and explosive. He lashed out with uncontrolled fury, accusing the Romans of arrogance and insatiable greed. In his view, their constant embassies were nothing more than disguised surveillance, sent to monitor every word he spoke and every action he took. He complained that Rome expected him to live and rule according to its will, as though his kingdom existed merely to obey foreign authority. His speech rose in intensity as he spoke, turning into a sharp and bitter tirade. At last, after exhausting himself in anger, he dismissed the envoys for the day, instructing them to return on the following morning when he would present his answer in writing. When the envoys returned, they received a formal response that was no less defiant, though it was expressed with more control. Perseus rejected the idea that he was bound by agreements made under his father. The treaty, he argued, had been imposed upon him at a time when he had only just taken the throne and lacked the strength to oppose it. Its renewal, therefore, could not be taken as a true reflection of his will. If Rome wished to establish a new understanding, then it should begin by negotiating openly and on equal terms. Only then would he consider what obligations might follow. Any agreement, he insisted, must rest on balance, not submission, and he expected that Rome would act in accordance with its own interests, just as he intended to act in his. The atmosphere in the palace shifted as soon as the document had been delivered. Officials began clearing the hall, and it became clear that the audience was over. At that moment, the Roman envoys made their position unmistakable. They declared that the relationship between Rome and Macedonia was at an end. The alliance was renounced. Perseus, already on edge, reacted with renewed anger. He halted abruptly, turned back toward them, and ordered them to leave his kingdom within 3 days. There was no attempt at courtesy, no gesture of diplomacy. The envoys departed without having received the basic respect that was usually extended even between rivals. Their mission had ended not in negotiation, but in open hostility. Back in Rome, the consequences of these exchanges began to unfold. After hearing reports from other delegations, the Senate sent instructions to the consuls, urging that elections be held as soon as possible so that new leadership could be prepared for what was clearly approaching. Although the war had not yet been formally declared, the situation was moving rapidly in that direction. In the meantime, the consuls focused their attention on stabilizing Liguria, where unrest had grown severe enough to threaten wider disruption. It was judged that restoring order there was more urgent than any other domestic undertaking. At the same time, new suspicions emerged from the Adriatic. Envoys from the island of Issa arrived in Rome with troubling news about the Illyrian king Gentius. They accused him of attacking their territory and warned that he was acting in concert with Perseus. According to their report, both kings were preparing for war against Rome, and Illyrian representatives currently in the city were not true diplomats, but spies sent to gather intelligence. The Illyrians were summoned before the Senate and questioned about their purpose. They claimed they had come to answer any accusations brought against their king, but their explanation failed to convince. They had not followed the proper procedures for envoys, nor had they made their presence known through official channels. Their answers were uncertain, and the Senate dismissed them without granting the formal recognition given to legitimate embassies. Instead, a new Roman delegation was sent to confront Gentius directly, to present the complaints of Rome's allies and to warn him against actions that would harm those under Roman protection. Meanwhile, Roman envoys who had travelled through the eastern Mediterranean returned with reports that helped clarify the broader political landscape. They had met with major rulers across the region and found that most remained loyal to Rome despite approaches from Perseus. Yet not all loyalties were firm. Some cities, particularly Rhodes, appeared uncertain, influenced by Macedonian diplomacy. Rhodian representatives arrived in Rome seeking to defend their reputation, but the Senate refused to hear them immediately, choosing instead to wait until the new consuls had taken office. The message was clear. Rome was no longer willing to tolerate hesitation or ambiguity among its allies. At this stage, the Senate decided that further delay would be dangerous. Preparations for war began in earnest. A large naval force was ordered to be made ready, drawing from existing ships and additional vessels from Sicily if necessary. Crews were assembled from both Roman citizens and allied populations. At the same time, a substantial army was raised from allied communities, with the intention of deploying it to the Adriatic coast. An experienced commander was placed in charge of this force and instructed to move it to a strategic position from which it could be transported across the sea when the moment came. Orders were sent to reinforce these preparations with seasoned troops already serving in northern Italy. Every measure was carried out with urgency. Ships were refitted, supplies were gathered, and grain was purchased in advance to sustain both fleet and army. By the time the commander reached the port, everything was in place, ready for immediate action. As the year drew to a close, one of the consuls returned to Rome to oversee the elections. His report on earlier campaigns did not receive a warm reception. The Senate, still angered by previous conduct in Liguria, responded with criticism rather than praise. Questions were raised about failures to correct earlier injustices, and the atmosphere remained tense. Nevertheless, the elections proceeded. New consuls were chosen, along with a full set of magistrates who would carry responsibility into the coming year. On the first day of their term, the new leaders carried out the traditional religious rites, offering sacrifices and prayers for success in the conflict that was now expected. A vow was also made that, should the state remain secure for the next decade, a series of public games and offerings would be held in gratitude. These ceremonies reflected both confidence and anxiety, as Rome prepared to commit itself to a major war. By the time the new consuls had taken office, the entire Mediterranean world was focused on the looming war between Rome and Macedonia. Every ruler and every city was calculating its position. Some, like Eumenes, were firmly committed to Rome, driven by both long-standing hostility and recent personal experience. Others chose neutrality, waiting to see how events would unfold. Some rulers offered support to Rome while quietly pursuing their own ambitions elsewhere. A few remained undecided, their loyalty uncertain. In many regions, popular sentiment leaned toward Macedonia, while political elites often favoured Rome. Others, more cautious, hoped that neither side would achieve total dominance, believing that a balance of power offered the best hope for stability. Amid this complex web of alliances and expectations, Rome took the final steps toward war. Religious signs were interpreted as favourable, and the Senate moved to bring the matter before the people. The charges against Perseus were laid out clearly. He had attacked Roman allies, violated agreements, seized territory, and prepared openly for war. Unless he offered full satisfaction, Rome would take up arms. The decision was no longer theoretical. It was placed before the citizens as a question that demanded action. Once this was done, attention turned to the practical division of command. One consul would remain in Italy, while the other would lead the campaign against Macedonia. Additional forces were assigned specifically for this Eastern War, larger and more experienced than usual. Even older veterans were called back into service, and many volunteered willingly, remembering the wealth gained in earlier campaigns. The scale of preparation showed how seriously the coming struggle was being taken. During the recruitment process, a dispute arose that revealed something of the Roman military spirit. Experienced soldiers objected to being assigned lower ranks than they had previously held. The issue was brought before the authorities and debated publicly. Among those who spoke was a veteran named Spurius Ligustinus. He was not a man of high birth or great wealth, but his life told a different kind of story. Born into a modest farming family, he had spent years in military service across many campaigns. He described his upbringing, his family, and his long record of service with quiet pride. He had fought in multiple wars, earned promotions through courage, and been honoured repeatedly for bravery. Though he was now past the age when service was required, he did not ask to be excused. Instead, he made a simple point. Rank, he said, mattered less than duty. The commander should place each man where he would be most useful. His responsibility, and that of every soldier, was to prove his worth through action. He reminded his fellow veterans that in their youth they had obeyed authority without question, and that they should do the same now. Service to the state, in whatever role was assigned, was itself an honour. His words carried weight. They reflected not only personal discipline, but the broader values that had shaped Rome's armies for generations. As the Republic prepared to face a powerful and determined enemy, it was not only fleets and legions that would decide the outcome, but also the mindset of the men who filled their ranks. After Spurius Ligustinus finished speaking, the effect was immediate. Publius Licinius did not treat the veteran's words as the simple statement of an old soldier. He treated them as something larger, as a living example of the discipline and endurance on which Rome had built its power. He praised him openly before the crowd, then brought him from the assembly straight into the Senate. There too, the old centurion was received with formal gratitude. The senators honoured him for his courage and long service, and the military officers, moved by both his record and the force of his example, restored him to the highest centurionate in the First Legion. The dispute that had threatened to complicate the levy ended at once. The other centurions abandoned their appeal and submitted without resistance. In a moment when the Republic was preparing for one of its most serious wars, the scene stood as a reminder that Rome's strength did not rest only on decrees, supplies, and generals, but on men whose entire lives had been shaped by obedience, hardship, and the expectation of service. The Latin festival was held early at the start of June, so that the consuls could move more quickly to their provinces and lose no more time. Once the rites were over, Gaius Lucretius departed for Brundisium, where preparations for the fleet had already been set in motion. Ships, equipment, and naval supplies were in place before he arrived. At the same time, another magistrate had been charged with organising 4 reserve legions for the defence of the city and Italy, each with the usual complement of infantry and cavalry, and with selecting commanders for them from the Senate. A large allied force was also being assembled, intended to stand ready wherever the Senate judged it needed most. The scale of this mobilization showed how completely Rome was now shifting from suspicion to action. This was no longer merely a diplomatic crisis. It was the organized beginning of a major war. Publius Licinius, who would command in Macedonia, also asked that his forces be strengthened by specialists and foreign auxiliaries. The Senate agreed. Ligurian troops were added, along with Cretan archers, and arrangements were made to secure Numidian cavalry and elephants. Envoys were sent to Massinissa and to Carthage to obtain these supports, while another delegation was directed to Crete. Rome was not leaving this war to chance. Every useful ally, every available resource, every kind of troop that might prove valuable in a difficult eastern campaign was being drawn into the effort. The Republic was preparing not merely to resist Perseus, but to overwhelm him. At that same time, envoys from Perseus arrived. The Senate had already resolved on war, and the Roman people had confirmed the decision, so these men were not admitted into the city itself. Instead, they were brought before the Senate at the Temple of Bellona, the place often used when Rome wished to hear foreign representatives, without granting them the full dignity of entry. Their message was cautious and simple on the surface. Perseus, they said, wanted to know why Roman forces had already been sent to Macedonia. If those forces could be withdrawn, then the king, according to the Senate's judgment, would be prepared to make amends for whatever injuries Rome's allies claimed to have suffered. But Rome had already gathered too much evidence, and one of its own men was present for that very purpose. Spurius Carvilius had recently returned from Greece, sent back by the Roman commander there, specifically, to lay out fresh accusations. He described the king's hostile movements in Perrhaebia, the seizure of cities in Thessaly, and the broader pattern of activity already underway. When the Macedonian envoys were ordered to respond, they hesitated and claimed they had no authority to discuss such matters. That answer finished the exchange. They were told to report to Perseus that Publius Licinius would soon be in Macedonia with an army, and that if the king truly wished to make reparations, he could send his representatives to the consul there. Coming to Rome was now useless. They were further informed that they would not be allowed to travel through Italy as though normal relations still existed. Licinius himself was ordered to see that they left the country within 15 days under supervision until they had boarded ship. Diplomacy had not entirely ended, but it had been pushed out of Rome and onto the edge of the battlefield. Before the consuls had even reached their provinces, Roman operations were already underway across the Adriatic. Gnaeus Sicinius had gone on ahead to the fleet and army at Brundisium before his own term expired. He crossed into Epirus with 5,000 infantry and 300 cavalry, then established a camp near Apollonia. From there, he detached troops to occupy strong positions among peoples who feared Macedonian attack and had asked for protection. In this way, Rome was doing more than preparing its own advance. It was moving into allied and neighbouring territory, securing the approaches, holding the coast, and making sure that when the main army arrived, it would find a framework already in place. The war hadn't yet been fought, but the map was already being shaped. A few days later, Another group of Roman envoys reached Greece with 1,000 soldiers. Once they had landed, they divided both the country and the force among themselves, according to their missions. One was sent to the Illyrian king Gentius, not only to test his loyalty to Rome, but, if possible, to draw him into active alliance. Others were dispatched through the Peloponnese and along the western coast, while the principal envoys moved through Epirus, Aetolia, and Thessaly, intending afterward to examine conditions in Boeotia and Euboea before joining their colleagues again, farther south. Even before the campaign formally opened, Rome was surrounding Macedonia with diplomacy, pressure, warnings, and the visible presence of armed men. While these envoys were still at Corcyra, a letter arrived from Perseus asking why the Romans had come into Greece and why they were placing garrisons in certain cities. No written answer was given. Instead, the messenger was told simply that Rome was acting to protect those communities. The reply was brief, but it said everything necessary. Rome no longer felt obliged to explain itself in detail. It had reached the point where it considered its intervention justification enough. The envoys who moved through the Peloponnese urged every city they visited to support Rome against Perseus, with the same loyalty they had shown in earlier wars. Their appeal did not fall on uniform ground. Among the Achaeans there was irritation. They felt that after all their loyalty and service to Rome, they were being treated no differently from peoples who had once fought on the other side and only later come under Roman influence. Meanwhile, communities recently absorbed into the Achaean League resented the implication that they were now little more than the spoil of past victories. Rome could summon allies, but not all allies heard its call with the same enthusiasm. Elsewhere, the Roman mission had more immediate success. In Epirus, one city welcomed the envoys warmly, and young men were sent from there to garrison a district recently freed from Macedonian control. In Aetolia, the Romans waited long enough for a change in local leadership, because the political complexion of the region mattered greatly to them. Once a man favourable to Rome had entered office, they moved on to Thessaly. There, they received representatives from Acarnania and exiles from Boeotia. The message to the Acarnanians was stern but not hopeless. They were reminded that they had once taken the wrong side in earlier wars, but that this was their chance to repair the past. If Rome had shown leniency before, it could show generosity again, provided loyalty were now proved by action. The Boeotians, for their part, tried to excuse their alliance with Perseus by blaming it on one faction and one leader in particular. They claimed that some cities had been drawn into it unwillingly. The Roman answer was subtle. These things, they said, would soon become evident because Rome intended to give each city its own autonomy. It was a promise, but also a threat. The existing political structure could be broken apart if it had sheltered the wrong loyalties. At Larissa, a general meeting of the Thessalians took place. Here, the atmosphere was far more favourable to Rome. Thessaly remembered the freedom it had received and the support previously exchanged in wars against Philip and Antiochus. After these shared services were recalled, the broader population was ready to grant almost everything Rome wanted. Gratitude and calculation often mixed easily in Greek politics, and in this case, they ran in the same direction. It was there, after the meeting, that envoys from Perseus approached the Roman commissioners privately. They relied especially on the old bond of guest friendship that had once linked the Macedonian court with the family of Quintus Marcius. They asked that the king be given the chance to meet him directly. Marcius answered in a carefully measured way. He said he knew of the relationship between their fathers and had even undertaken his mission partly with that bond in mind. He claimed that if his health had allowed it, he would not have delayed a meeting. Now, as soon as he could, he would come to the river where a crossing could be arranged, and the king could be informed in advance. The words were mild, but their effect was much larger than they seemed. By speaking in this tone, Marsyas gave Perseus just enough reason to hope that some accommodation might still be found. That hint of hope achieved something immediate. Perseus withdrew from the exposed position he had been holding and pulled back deeper into his own kingdom. A few days later, the meeting took place at the agreed crossing. It was a scene watched with enormous curiosity. The king arrived with a large retinue crowded by companions and attendants. The Roman envoys came with an equally impressive company. Not only their own escort, but also delegations and onlookers from nearby cities who wanted to witness the encounter and later carry home some reliable account of what had passed. Here was the king of Macedonia facing the representatives of the greatest power in the Mediterranean, and even before a word was spoken, the spectacle itself was political theatre. At first, the two parties stood on opposite sides of the river, and even the question of who should cross became a matter of prestige. Perseus's people argued that the king's dignity required the Romans to come to him. The Romans answered that the name of their people stood above that claim, especially since it was the king who had requested the meeting. In the end, Marsyas broke the deadlock with a joke that cleverly turned status into familiarity. Since his own family name echoed that of Philip, he quipped that the son should come to the father. Perseus accepted the jest and crossed. Then another disagreement arose over how many men might accompany him. He wanted to bring his full train. The Romans insisted he cross with only a few, or else provide hostages to guarantee that no trick was intended. He surrendered 2 of his leading companions. This demand was less about genuine fear than about appearances. It made clear to all the watching allies that the king was not meeting Rome as an equal. Even so, the opening exchange was not openly hostile. Greetings were polite, almost warm, and the men took the seats that had been prepared. After a short silence, Marsyas began. He said he assumed Perseus wanted an answer to the question he had sent earlier, asking why Roman envoys had come to Greece with troops and why garrisons were being placed in allied cities. Marsyas admitted that this was uncomfortable ground. To remain silent might look arrogant. To speak plainly might seem harsh. But, he said, when a treaty had been broken, rebuke was justified, whether in deeds or in words. He then moved into the substance of Rome's case. According to Marsyas, the Senate believed that since taking the throne, Perseus had only once acted properly, when he renewed the treaty with Rome. Yet even that act now seemed worse than pointless, because the treaty had been renewed only to be ignored. He listed the charges one by one. A Roman ally had been driven from his kingdom. The killers of another friendly ruler had found shelter in Macedonia, and the way Perseus had handled that affair had made it seem as though he approved the murder. He had marched with an army into Delphi by a route that itself violated the agreement. He had sent assistance to Byzantium in defiance of the treaty. He had entered into a hidden oath-bound arrangement with the Boeotians. Questions surrounded the deaths of men who had intended to bring word of his conduct to Rome. There was suspicion too over the civil violence in Aetolia, over the destruction of the Dolopes, over the attempt on Eumenes at Delphi, and over the secret crimes connected to the poison plot revealed by Ramios of Brundisium. Marsyas said he would have preferred not to speak such things to a man connected to him by inherited ties of hospitality. But since Perseus had asked why Roman forces were being moved and cities occupied, he had made the answer unavoidable. He ended by saying that, because of the old relationship between their houses, he remained willing to hear whatever Perseus wished to say, and hoped there might still be some argument that could be carried back to the Senate. Perseus replied with skill and sharpness. He began by saying that he could make a strong case if he were speaking before neutral judges, rather than men who were both accusers and arbiters at once. Some of the charges, he said, were so weak that they were made of words and could be answered with words. Others, he suggested, ought not to shame him at all. As for the testimony of Eumenes and Ramius, he treated both with contempt. Eumenes, he argued, was a personal enemy who had burdened many others besides Macedonia, a man whose hostility was hardly a reliable guide to truth. Ramius was even easier to dismiss. Someone he had scarcely known and had no reason to choose as a partner in conspiracy. He brushed aside the deaths of certain Thebans by claiming they had perished at sea. And when it came to the Illyrian ruler's murder, he pointed out that the only fact alleged against him was that the killers had entered his kingdom afterward. If Rome wanted to hold him responsible for crimes committed by exiles who passed into Macedonia, then by the same logic, Rome itself should answer for every exile who entered Italy. Since no one in the world accepted such a principle, he said, neither would he. Once he learned that certain fugitives were indeed in Macedonia, he added, he had driven them out. Then Perseus turned from criminal accusation to the larger question of kingship and treaties. If the agreement with Rome was to be interpreted as meaning that he had no right even to defend his own kingdom, then he admitted he had broken it by using force against Brutality. But if treaties and the common laws between states allowed force to be met with force, then what exactly had he been supposed to do? Brutality had ravaged Macedonian territory, carried off free people, slaves and herds, and driven destruction deep into the kingdom. Was the king expected to remain motionless until armed enemies marched all the way to his palace? If he had been justified in fighting, then the defeat of the aggressor could not afterward be treated as a crime. The man who began the war, Perseus argued, had no right to complain about what happened after he lost it. On the Dolopes, Perseus took a different line. He did not try to deny severity. Instead, he claimed right. They were, he said, under his authority, assigned previously to his father, and therefore within the legitimate reach of Macedonian power. Even if a harsher moral standard were applied, he insisted that his actions had not exceeded what their conduct deserved. The governor he had placed over them had been killed, and in his view the punishment they received was lighter than the offence merited. As for Delphi, he denied the sinister picture Rome had painted. He said he had gone there after visiting nearby places, not to see cities or install garrisons, but to fulfill old vows by sacrifice. The claim that he had marched there with his army as part of some hidden design was, in his telling, an exaggeration meant to darken his reputation. Let the Greek cities through whose lands he passed be assembled, he said. If even one complained of injury at the hands of his soldiers, then the accusation might stand. Otherwise, the charge was nothing but distortion. He admitted that he had aided the Aetolians and Byzantium and made an agreement with the Boeotians, but he pointed out that these actions had not been hidden. His envoys had repeatedly explained them at Rome. It was only after Eumenes appeared that everything was recast as suspicious and hostile. According to Perseus, Eumenes had one real goal: to persuade Rome that Greece could never be truly free so long as Macedonia still stood secure. And if that argument succeeded, he warned, its logic would not stop with Macedonia. One day, someone would say that pushing Antiochus back beyond Taurus had achieved nothing, because Pergamum itself had become the greater menace to Asia. A kingdom looking down from its citadel over all its neighbours could be portrayed as a danger just as easily as Macedonia was being portrayed now. In closing, Perseus tried to shift the matter away from accusation and toward judgment. What mattered, he said, was not simply what he had done, but how those listening chose to interpret it. He claimed he had done nothing deliberately wrong, and if through error of judgment he had gone too far, then correction, warning, and reproach should be enough. Nothing he had done, he insisted, was beyond repair. Nothing truly required the violent remedy of war. If Rome's fame for clemency and justice meant anything, then it should not rush to arms against an allied king on grounds that scarcely rose above grievance and complaint. That was the appeal with which he ended. Not humble, not submissive, but still carefully framed, as though there remained one last chance to turn back from open conflict. Yet by this point, both sides had spoken from positions already hardened. The language of friendship remained, but the shape of war could already be seen behind it. Marcius heard the king out with visible approval, or at least with the appearance of approval, and from that point he encouraged the next step. Perseus should send envoys to Rome. The king's advisers agreed. In a moment so uncertain, every opening, however slight, seemed worth testing. If even a narrow path toward peace still existed, it could not be ignored. From there, the discussion turned to something practical and urgent. How messengers might travel safely. That immediately brought up the question of a truce. Under the circumstances, it was unavoidable, and in truth it was exactly what Marcius had wanted from the beginning, though he granted it as though it had been a reluctant concession, some rare favour extracted by insistence. The irony was plain. At that moment, Rome was not yet fully ready. Its army was not assembled, its command was not fully established, and its preparations were still incomplete. Perseus, by contrast, had nearly everything in place. He had troops, resources, positions, and momentum. Had he not allowed himself to be distracted by the hope that negotiation might still save the situation, he could have begun the war at the most favourable possible moment for himself, and at the most awkward possible moment for his enemies. Formal pledges were exchanged to guarantee observance of the truce, and once that was done, the Roman envoys broke off the conference and moved immediately toward Boeotia. The region was already slipping into unrest. The Roman suggestion that each city would soon make clear whether it had truly wanted an alliance with Perseus had spread quickly, and now the old united structure of Boeotia was beginning to crack. Some communities started drifting away from the common league. Along the road, first envoys from Chaeronea and then men from Thebes came to the Romans, insisting that they had not even been present when the alliance with the Macedonian king had been approved. Marcius and his colleagues gave them no answer then and there. Instead, they instructed them to keep following and present themselves later at Chalcis. Inside Thebes itself, events had already become chaotic for reasons that went beyond the Macedonian question. A bitter factional struggle had erupted during the election of the chief magistrate and the other leading officials. The losing side, furious at its humiliation, gathered a crowd of its own and issued a proclamation in Thebes, barring the new office holders from the cities. Those men went into exile at Thespiae, where they were received willingly, but before long a swing in popular feeling allowed them to return. Once back in power at Thebes, they retaliated by decreeing exile for the men who had summoned the assembly and council without proper authority. Then the newly installed magistrate, Ismenias, a noble and influential figure, went even further and sentenced them to death after they had fled. Those exiles escaped to Chalcis, and from there travelled to meet the Romans at Larissa, where they accused Ismenias of being the driving force behind the alliance with Perseus. These local rivalries, private hatreds, and struggles for office all blended into the larger political crisis. By the time the Romans arrived, both camps were trying to use them. On one side stood the exiles, and the men who blamed Ismenias. On the other stood Ismenias himself and those who defended his position. When the Romans reached Chalcis, events moved quickly in a direction that pleased them greatly. One after another, leading men in different cities publicly rejected the alliance with Perseus and aligned themselves with Rome instead. Even Ismenias, faced with the changing mood, concluded that the only sensible course was now to place the Boeotian people on the Roman side. That decision immediately triggered another outbreak of violence. He would likely have been killed by the exiles and their supporters had he not managed to take refuge at the Roman headquarters. Thebes itself, the chief city of Boeotia, was now in a state of intense internal struggle. One group still pulled toward Perseus, another pressed toward Rome. On top of that, men from Coronea and Haliartus had come in to defend the alliance with the king. In the end, however, the argument of the pro-Roman leaders carried the day. They kept reminding the wider public of what had happened to Philip and Antiochus, using those examples to show the reach, fortune, and destructive power of Rome. That line of argument slowly wore down resistance. The decision was finally made to abolish the alliance with Perseus. After that reversal, the city sent to Chalcis the very men who had supported the alliance in the first place, so that they could attempt a reconciliation with the Roman envoys. Thebes formally placed itself in Roman good faith. Marcius and Petilius received these overtures with satisfaction. They advised both Thebes and the other cities to send their own embassies to Rome and renew friendly relations there. They also insisted on one further step that mattered greatly to them. The exiles had to be restored, and those who had backed the alliance with Perseus were condemned by Roman authority. In this way, the Romans achieved one of their clearest political goals, without fighting a battle. The Boeotian League was broken apart. The old collective body, which might have acted in concert with Macedonia, was dissolved into separate cities, each more vulnerable and easier to influence. Once that had been accomplished, the envoys moved on toward the Peloponnese, summoning one of their colleagues to join them at Chalcis before continuing. At Argos, an assembly was arranged for them, and there they asked the Achaeans for only one concrete thing: 1,000 soldiers. These men were to serve as a garrison for Chalcis until the Roman army could arrive in Greece. The request was granted. Then, as winter deepened, Marcius and Petilius made their way back to Rome, their mission complete. They had achieved what they had really wanted. They had delayed Perseus, unsettled his allies, broken the cohesion of Boeotia, reassured some wavering communities, and bought time for Rome to arm. Around the same period, another Roman delegation was sent out from the city to travel through Asia and the islands. Their purpose was to persuade allied communities to support the coming war against Perseus. They proceeded with special care among the wealthier and more influential cities, knowing that smaller states often followed the lead of the stronger ones around them. Among all these communities, Rhodes mattered most. Rhodes had not only prestige and influence, but a fleet and resources that could actively strengthen the Roman cause. One of its leading men, Agesilaus, had already pushed matters in that direction. While serving as chief magistrate, he had repeatedly urged his fellow citizens to abandon any lingering hope of relying on kings, a policy that experience had shown to be uncertain and dangerous, and instead to remain firm in their Roman alliance, which he described as the one connection in the world at that time that offered both real strength and real reliability. He argued that war with Perseus was plainly approaching, and that Rome would need the same kind of naval support that had once been necessary in earlier wars, and perhaps even more. If Rhodes waited until the last minute, its fleet would have to be repaired, equipped, and manned in panic. It was far wiser to begin at once, to have everything ready before a crisis forced hurried action. There was also another motive. Rhodes had been shadowed by suspicion ever since Eumenes had hinted that its attitude was uncertain. The surest answer to such accusations would not be speeches, but visible action. These arguments worked. By the time the Roman envoys arrived, 40 Rhodian ships had already been prepared, fully equipped and fully crewed. The display was deliberate. It showed the Romans that no prodding was necessary. This embassy had a strong effect in Asia because it helped tip opinion toward Rome. Not every envoy, however, was equally successful. One member of the mission returned empty-handed, weighed down by suspicion that he had accepted bribes in Illyrian affairs and his credibility had already been damaged. After his meeting with the Romans, Perseus went back to Macedonia and pressed forward with the diplomacy that Marsyas had encouraged. He sent envoys to Rome to continue the peace discussions that had been opened at the river. He also sent letters to Byzantium, Rhodes, and other cities. The message was broadly the same in each case. He described the conference in a way that made it appear that he had gained the upper hand in argument and had spoken from strength. To the Rhodians, his envoys added a more pointed appeal. They declared that there was every reason to believe peace could still be achieved, since Marsyas and Petilius had themselves encouraged the sending of ambassadors to Rome. But if Rome continued to push toward war in defiance of existing agreements, then Rhodes should use all its influence and all its resources to restore peace. If persuasion failed, they argued, then the Rhodians would need to consider whether it was wise to allow the ordering of the whole world to fall into the hands of a single people. That, they said, mattered to everyone, but especially to Rhodes. If every state began looking only to Rome, then Rhodian wealth and standing would inevitably be drawn under Roman control. The argument was received warmly enough, though the warmth of the response mattered more than its practical effect. In Rhodes, the party led by the nobles had already begun to recover its influence, and their hold on opinion proved stronger than Perseus's message. The official reply was careful. Rhodes favoured peace, they said. But if war came, the king should expect nothing from Rhodes that would force the city to break its long-established friendship with Rome, a relationship formed through many important services in peace and war alike. It was not the answer Perseus wanted, but neither was it a full embrace of Rome's position. It showed that Rhodes still hoped to preserve room for itself. On their return from Rhodes, Perseus' envoys also visited Boeotian cities, such as Thebes, Coronea, and Haliartus, believing that these communities had been compelled against their will to cast off the alliance with Macedonia and attach themselves to Rome. In Thebes, they found no willingness to move back toward the king, though there was intense resentment against the Romans for condemning local leaders and forcing the recall of exiles. Coronea and Haliartus were different. These cities retained a natural sympathy for kingship and sent their own representatives to Macedonia, asking for a garrison that might help them defend themselves against Theban aggression. Perseus refused to send one. He said the truce with Rome prevented such a move. Still, he encouraged them to avenge what they saw as Theban offences in whatever way they could, provided they did not give Rome an excuse for direct retaliation. Even while the truce lasted, the king was still trying to preserve influence where he could. When Marsyas and Petilius returned to Rome, they presented their report on the Capitoline and boasted above all about one thing. They had deceived Perseus with the truce and with the hope of peace. At the moment they met him, they said Rome had not been ready for war, while the king had been fully prepared and might have taken key positions before any Roman force could arrive in Greece. By giving him hope and drawing him into delay, they had reversed the situation. Thanks to the truce, Rome now had time to arm, organise and cross over, so that when war began, the two sides would meet on far more equal footing. They also took pride in having broken apart the Boeotian League, so that it could never again easily act in concert with the Macedonian king. Most of the Senate admired these achievements and praised the envoys as men of high strategic intelligence. But not everyone approved. Older senators, and those who still liked to think of Rome in terms of older custom and older standards, found little that felt Roman in this embassy. Their ancestors, they said, had not waged war by trickery, by deception, or by inducing an enemy to relax while danger was drawing near. They had declared war openly, sometimes even naming the place where battle would be fought. They remembered the story of Pyrrhus's doctor, whose plot had been exposed to the king instead of exploited. They remembered how a traitor had once been bound and handed over rather than rewarded. That, they argued, was Roman conduct. Craft, delay, calculated falsehood, and delight in outwitting the enemy belonged more to Greek subtlety or Carthaginian scheming than to Rome. Deceit might sometimes produce a temporary advantage, but a man's spirit was only truly conquered when he admitted that he had been defeated in a just and open struggle, not by artifice or mere bad luck. This was the view of the older men, yet theirs was no longer the dominant voice. Many now cared more for useful results than for the old code of honourable simplicity. In the end, expediency prevailed. As a result, Marcius's conduct was officially approved, and he was sent back to Greece with warships and further authority to act, as he judged best for the state. Aulus Petilius was sent to occupy Larissa in Thessaly, because once the truce expired, there was a real fear that Perseus might move a garrison into that city and thereby secure the chief centre of Thessaly for himself. Petilius was instructed to draw 2,000 infantry from the force already under Roman control for this purpose. Another Roman officer, returning from Achaea, was given Italian troops and ordered to help keep Boeotia under control from Thebes. Rome was using the interval well. Even the truce that had been granted to Perseus was being turned into a tool against him. Once these arrangements had been made, the Senate agreed to hear the ambassadors, whom Perseus had sent, even though the machinery of war was already fixed in motion. And their speech repeated almost all the arguments that the king himself had made at the conference. They dealt especially with the accusation concerning the attempt on Eumenes' life, and they tried to answer it thoroughly, though not convincingly. The evidence was too strong and too widely believed. Everything else in their appeal was shaped as an earnest plea. But the Senate was in no mood to be moved. Minds had hardened. The envoys were ordered to leave the city at once, to go beyond the walls immediately, and to quit Italy within 30 days. From that point onward, the move toward war became fully visible. Publius Licinius, the consul assigned to Macedonia, was instructed to announce the earliest possible day for the army to assemble. The praetor in charge of the fleet sailed out from Rome with 40 quinqueremes, keeping some vessels back for other duties near the city. Another commander moved separately with additional ships gathered from allied communities according to treaty obligations. He collected vessels from various Italian cities, crossed the Ionian Sea, picked up more craft at Dyrrhachium, accepted ships from Essa, and even received a large number from King Gentius, who still pretended that these had been prepared for Roman use. All of them were brought together at Corcyra and then moved onward to Cephallania. Meanwhile, the praetor himself crossed from Italy and arrived there a few days later. The fleet then lay at anchor, waiting for the main land army to complete its crossing and for the supply vessels that had fallen behind to catch up. At almost exactly the same time, Publius Licinius performed the solemn departure rites on the capital, put on military dress, and left Rome. Such moments always carried great weight in the city. A consul going out to war was never merely a political act. It was a public spectacle full of seriousness, ceremony, and uncertainty. Crowds followed because of the dignity of the office, but also because of something deeper. A desire to see the man to whom the defence of the Republic had been entrusted. The moment naturally drew the mind toward the hazards of war, the instability of fortune, and the immense burden laid on a commander's judgment. People thought of past defeats brought on by rashness, and past victories won by courage and foresight. They wondered whether the man leaving the city would one day return triumphant to climb the capital again, or whether that triumph would instead become the joy of his enemies. In this case, those thoughts were sharpened by the name of the enemy. Licinius was going out against Perseus, heir to the fame of Macedonia, to the military reputation of Philip, and to years of ominous expectation. Ever since Perseus had inherited the kingdom, his name and the prospect of war had been spoken together. Men of every rank walked with the consul as he departed. 2 former consuls served with him as military tribunes. Several prominent young nobles also accompanied him, men whose names and families made their presence noticed. With this company he went to Brundisium, joined the army there, crossed the sea, and landed near Apollonia, where he established his camp. The Roman war had now physically arrived in the Greek world. A few days before this, Perseus had held a council of his own, after the return of his envoys from Rome had finally cut short the last serious hope of peace. Opinions in that council were divided, and the debate lasted a long time. Some urged concession. If Rome demanded money, then money should be paid. If territory must be given up, then territory should be surrendered. Whatever had to be endured for peace, they argued, was better than risking everything on a single throw. As long as Perseus remained king and his position on the throne survived, time itself could change many things. Losses might later be recovered. Circumstances might shift. The day might come when those now feared would themselves become afraid. But most of the council argued in the opposite direction. These men were more warlike, and they insisted that any concession at all would only invite the next demand, and then the next, until nothing remained. Rome, they said, did not truly need money or land. What it could not tolerate was the existence of a nearby kingdom still capable, under the right circumstances, of reviving something of Macedon's old greatness. Carthage had been broken and left under the shadow of a hostile neighbouring king. Antiochus had been driven back and stripped of reach. Macedonia alone remained close enough, old enough, and still formidable enough to matter. If Perseus surrendered piece by piece, he would eventually surrender the kingdom itself and end as a beggar on some island, an aging exile who had survived only to watch his crown disappear. Better, they said, to defend rank and honour with arms, to face whatever ruin war might bring, or, if fortune turned, to free the world from Roman domination. They argued that Rome's hold on Greece was no more eternal than Hannibal's hold on Italy had once seemed. If Perseus had once fought to keep his brother from taking the throne unlawfully, how could he now hand that same throne over to outsiders after securing it for himself? Beneath all the specific arguments about peace and war lay one shared conviction that gradually dominated the room. Nothing was more shameful than giving up without resistance. Nothing was more glorious than risking everything for dignity, kingship, and name. With that thought, the choice was made in spirit, even before it was fixed in policy. Perseus and his kingdom were moving toward war not because every man believed victory was certain, but because too many believed that survival without honour was worse than defeat. At Pella, the ancient heart of Macedonian power, the king gathered his council and made his decision clear. There would be no more hesitation. War was no longer a possibility. It was a choice, and one he now embraced openly. With a formal declaration and a call for divine favour, he set events into motion. Orders were sent across the kingdom, commanders were summoned, and troops began to assemble at a designated point. Before departing, he performed a grand sacrifice offering 100 animals to the war goddess, revered by his people. A ritual meant not only to honour tradition, but to strengthen morale. Surrounded by his closest companions and guards, he then rode out to join his army. At the assembly point, a vast force had already gathered. Soldiers from across Macedonia stood alongside contingents from allied lands. The king arranged his camp before the city and ordered the army to form up in the open plain. The scale of the force was impressive. Tens of thousands stood under arms. nearly half of them heavy infantry trained in the rigid formation that had once conquered continents. Among them were elite units selected for strength and youth, light troops skilled in skirmishing, and auxiliaries drawn from distant regions, Thracians, Gauls, Cretans, and Greeks, each bringing their own style of warfare. Cavalry units were also present in considerable numbers, including a contingent from Thrace under its own king. Altogether, the army approached a strength not seen since the days of the greatest Macedonian campaigns. This force had not been gathered overnight. For over 2 decades, Macedonia had known peace, and in that time a new generation had grown to fighting age. These men had not been idle. They had tested themselves in smaller conflicts along the borders, gaining experience without being worn down by long campaigns. Meanwhile, both the previous king and his successor had long anticipated a future clash with Rome. Supplies had been stockpiled, weapons forged, and strategies considered. Now, everything stood ready. The troops were briefly put through their movements, enough to show discipline and cohesion. Then, the king called them together. Standing before them with his sons at his side, he addressed the army with confidence and intensity. He reminded them of past grievances, of the way Rome had treated both him and his father, with what he described as arrogance and disrespect. He spoke of how negotiations had been nothing more than a delay tactic, while Roman forces quietly advanced into Greek lands. Now, he said, the enemy was on the move, bringing legions and allied troops, but their numbers, when compared to the assembled Macedonian host, were not overwhelming. He urged his soldiers to look not only at the enemy, but at themselves. They were seasoned, trained from youth, hardened by years of preparation. Their opponents, he claimed, were hastily gathered and unevenly equipped. His own army drew strength from fierce peoples known for their courage, while Roman allies came from lands less renowned for warfare. He pointed to the vast stores of supplies and wealth accumulated over years, enough to sustain a long campaign without strain. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. Victory, he suggested, would depend not on resources but on spirit. He invoked the memory of their ancestors, who had once dominated vast territories and pushed their conquests to the edges of the known world. Now, the stakes were even higher. This was no distant campaign. It was a struggle for their own homeland. Rome, he argued, no longer pretended to act in the name of freedom. Its true aim was domination. If the Macedonians chose submission, they would not only lose their king, but their independence and their arms. The choice was stark: resist or surrender everything. His words ignited the army. Cheers and shouts echoed across the ranks, filled with anger, pride, and determination. The reaction was so intense that he cut his speech short and gave orders to prepare for movement. Reports were already spreading that Roman forces were advancing, and there was no time to waste. After addressing the army, he turned to the representatives of Macedonian cities who had come to offer support. They promised supplies and money, eager to contribute to the war effort. The king accepted their loyalty but declined their resources, stating that the royal reserves were sufficient. Only practical needs were requested: transport for heavy equipment and artillery. With preparations complete, the army began its march. Moving through familiar territory, they advanced steadily, securing towns along the way. Some resisted briefly. Others surrendered immediately when faced with overwhelming force. Where resistance was encountered, it was crushed quickly. Where submission was offered, it was accepted with measured restraint. The king aimed to maintain momentum, advancing through mountain passes and into regions that opened the way toward Thessaly. Meanwhile, the Roman army was on the move as well. Their advance was far from easy. Difficult terrain slowed them, and their troops, less experienced and more heavily burdened, struggled through narrow and rugged paths. Had the Macedonian king chosen to strike at that moment, when the Roman forces were stretched and exhausted, the outcome might have been decisive. Even later accounts would acknowledge how vulnerable the Romans had been during this phase, but no such attack came. When the Roman army finally reached safer ground, relief quickly turned into confidence. They resupplied, rested, and then moved forward, only to discover that Macedonian forces were already raiding Allied lands freely. This forced them to advance again, eventually bringing the two armies within striking distance of each other. At first, engagements were limited. Cavalry and light troops skirmished, probing each other's strength. One such clash ended with minor losses on both sides, neither gaining a clear advantage. Yet tension continued to build. Day after day, the Macedonian forces maneuvered, attempting to draw the Romans into a vulnerable position. The Romans, wary and cautious, refused to be baited. Eventually, the king moved closer, establishing a new position within reach of the Roman camp. At dawn, his forces advanced in full formation, surprising the Romans with their early appearance. Panic spread briefly through the Roman ranks as soldiers rushed to prepare for battle. The Macedonian army deployed carefully, with cavalry and skirmishers arranged to exploit any weakness. The Romans responded by sending out their own cavalry and light troops, forming a defensive line. The battle that followed began with missile exchanges, but quickly escalated into close combat. The Macedonian cavalry, particularly the fierce Thracian units, charged with ferocity, disrupting the Roman lines. In the centre, the king himself led the assault, breaking through opposing forces and forcing them into retreat. The Roman position began to collapse. Only the disciplined withdrawal of certain allied cavalry units prevented a complete disaster. These troops managed to cover the retreat, allowing the main force to escape. The Macedonians had won the field, and their soldiers returned to camp in high spirits, celebrating their success. Yet the victory was incomplete. The king hesitated to press further. Though his infantry had begun to arrive and the enemy was disorganized, he chose not to risk everything in a single bold move. Advisors urged caution, arguing that a measured approach might secure greater advantages in the long run. The king accepted this advice and ordered a withdrawal. This decision would later be questioned. By not exploiting the moment fully, he allowed the Roman army to recover. The next day, the Romans withdrew to a stronger defensive position, crossing a river and fortifying their camp. The opportunity for a decisive blow had passed. In the days that followed, both sides reassessed their strategies. The Macedonians continued to maneuver, seeking opportunities to strike isolated groups. In one such encounter, they successfully ambushed Roman foragers, capturing supplies and prisoners. Encouraged by this success, the king attempted to press further, attacking a small Roman outpost. The defenders, outnumbered and surrounded, held their ground with determination. Despite heavy pressure and relentless missile fire, they refused to surrender. Their situation seemed hopeless until relief forces arrived. The Roman commander, recognizing the danger, led a rapid response with cavalry and allied troops. The sudden appearance of reinforcements turned the tide. The Macedonian forces, caught between their attack and the approaching enemy, fell into disorder. Attempts to retreat quickly became chaotic as crowded routes and obstacles disrupted their movement. Though they managed to escape a complete rout, they suffered losses and were forced to withdraw. This reversal had a clear effect. Roman confidence was restored, while Macedonian morale suffered. The king pulled back, reorganizing his forces and reconsidering his position. After several days, he chose to withdraw further, leaving behind garrisons and sending parts of his army into winter quarters. The Roman commander, meanwhile, advanced cautiously, securing key locations and reclaiming territory. Some towns were taken by force, Others surrendered without resistance. The campaign gradually shifted from open confrontation to consolidation and control. As winter approached, both armies settled into their positions. The Romans distributed their forces across allied cities for protection and comfort, while their commander turned his attention to securing strategic regions. The Macedonian king, having lost momentum, prepared for the next phase of the war. What had begun with confidence and early success had become a struggle of endurance and strategy. Neither side had achieved a decisive victory, but both now understood the scale of the conflict ahead.